All right, hello and welcome back to the Game Dev Show. Today I'm here with Yorai, Story, and Greg. And Powell might be jumping in just a little bit as well. We've got a couple interesting topics to talk about. We're going to be getting into project structure, building out games, and some stuff about art loading and mods. We got a couple interesting questions that I want to bring up and talk about. But first, I wanted to say welcome to everybody. If you're here with us live in chat, don't forget to say hello and hit thumbs up. And if you're not, then leave a comment and tell us when you watched it, I guess. Anyway, how's everybody doing today?
Pretty good. Had a long walk.
Pretty good.
Yeah. Got to think about a lot of stuff related to a project that I cannot very easily talk about, but I could try and convey some of its difficulty.
Somewhat of a secret project?
It's more of a thing in progress that's actually related to work. So, yeah. But just to get into it, so when you work on a multiplayer game, you have a case where inventory has to be managed on the server side, so there is no cheating, and that operations can happen by anybody. If the operations are done by the client, that means the client is manipulating the items and then sending the state to the server. There can be race conditions where two clients try to do the same action, send the state of the same thing to the server, and the server has no way to reconcile. It can't say, hey, I can't actually do anything with that, undo your work, because the client can already do something else if it's client authoritative. Now, Terraria is client authoritative. And I've been looking into the possibility of making actions occur on the server without compromising the state of individual clients when they try to make racing actions. So it comes down to very, very interesting options, whether you lock out the inventories and they temporarily become server side, and then you let operations happen, but then nothing can happen, and other options. And it's gotten to like those crazy memes where you have a bunch of nodes connected and you're like, but if I do this and this and this system can't do whatever it needs to do, and the player can do this action which absolutely cannot skip this part. So do I start making an action queue to make this action happen after the server has unlocked the items? Just to give an example, if a player dies, client side, they drop all their items. Client side, if their items are locked, they won't be dropped. Now you can press the button to lock your items for a simple operation just before you die, and you can't drop your items, keep them all on death. Not exactly ideal. Yeah. So it's been pretty interesting to consider how do you manage a responsive state while also making sure that there is integrity to it, because the responsiveness is always opposed to integrity on another end.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. You've got like the opposite of the problem that I always had to deal with things, because everything was always server authoritative and it was avoiding people doing bad things and then you largely causing dupes or breaking other systems.
Yeah, client prediction is a huge topic on its own. The idea that the server always has the correct idea, but it's giving you enough information for you to try and predict how things are going to continue, and then you have to correct yourself if they don't continue as you expected, which means you can predict how your own character will act when actually, maybe a character shot you dead in the middle of your action, so you're running 2 steps forward, doesn't actually occur, and you didn't actually grab a flag, so now you have to put the flag back to where it was, and the flag didn't pop the confetti because you didn't win.
Unplay the confetti.
Yeah, unplay all the confetti. It's the worst part. It's specifically the worst at its worst when you have to play one-off events that are dispatched to other systems. So, for example, if you're using Fmod for audio and you're saying play this sound, and now the event didn't happen, you have to say, hey, actually, can you cancel that? And you have to hope that the action didn't actually didn't already get too far so that the player could have heard it, because the worst part you can have is that you start hearing the thing and then it immediately corrects itself.
Yeah,
It
that would be a bad feeling.
Yeah, it also happens with things like fireball flash effects, etc. So there are ways to deal with that for anybody listening. You can actually check if it's server authoritative, server approved message that's like, this actually happened. It's a confirmed state, and then you can let the events happen. The problem is if you do that, you're waiting until that happens, and then you can't play it during the prediction. So there are things that will look wrong if you don't do everything. But if you
Yeah.
do everything and then the state corrects itself, you're kind of stuck.
Story, you have good solutions for that?
Is give up a solution, because that's usually once I hear about how complex some of this stuff gets, I usually nope out of it. No, but in seriousness, I was looking at a bunch of these solutions, because obviously there's very great videos from most multiplayer games where they'll talk about a lot of those different solutions. But what's funny is they'll often kind of shrug and go, "This is our best guess." My game of choice obviously was Overwatch back in the day, and so there was a lot of talk about how they did it. And it's funny how something like that is also very noticeable. You're talking about the unsatisfying effects of switching it. In Overwatch in particular, they literally switched halfway through their lifetime how they approached the order of what counts for that sort of reconstruction. And it had a lot of knock-on effects because I didn't even know what they had done exactly at first, but I did know that like certain timings and windows for things had swapped so that it was the abilities that would go through before it didn't. And so the side effect was they did a whole thing with abilities going off, especially ones that were long running. And so you ended up having these windows where, long story short, you weren't safe trying to risk abilities at the last minute if your internet connection wasn't great, because it would take your ability but then not refund you for various reasons. Yeah, it was just a fun it was a fun thing. But yeah, I honestly, networking stuff is something I kind of hands up and go, that's not really my area. I do see a lot of overlap. I was doing some recent look at how registers work in processors, and I find the whole thing fascinating because it has to do a lot of branch prediction, and there's a whole lot of stuff with like branch target buffers and how it handles various pre-calcs and variations, and it's kind of a fascinating topic in terms of how do you optimize for like possible things that could happen without these long waits and whatever. I imagine there's some overlap there, but again, it's not my area.
In regards to the overlaps with the buffers, you're talking about like copy and pasting en masse or through code or what?
Oh, I just mean like branch target buffers, where you kind of say any one of these two scenarios could happen. So you calculate both, but don't run it. And then you decide when you store a table of possible outcomes. And so if the time comes that one of them runs, you don't have to send back the pre-calc. You just sort of say, hit the flag that is the one that happened, and you can resolve quickly. Obviously, you were talking about things like particles, which are more like for the player and things where they're going to notice if things are rewound or undone. But in terms, so that's a lot harder to like, even if you do choose the fastest possible version. To go back to the example of, again, Overwatch, there's a sound when you use your ability, and I would hear it, I would see it, I would press the button, and then it would go, oh no, but you died before that happened. And obviously that didn't happen for me in my version because I literally pressed the button. And so yeah, those things are always harder to time at those moments.
Yeah. One way, by the way, to do most of this is to get a very weak audio signal to start, and then give yourself enough buffer time within that audio. But it's really difficult to do when you're shooting a barrel and you're expecting it to immediately explode and you're expecting to hear the explosion. Those are the kinds of sounds that like start really high up on the audio decibel count.
Yeah, if you have a warm-up time, it's much easier. But
yeah.
Should we talk a little bit about the thing you just linked?
Yeah, so a user on Story Server posted this, and basically it's a message from John Carmack. Story, I think you'd be better positioned to speak about who he is, but yeah.
It's just funny, this started surprising. It was one of those things, it didn't occur to me that was actually a contentious point, but apparently people have a lot stronger opinions of this than I thought they would. But anyway, John Carmack is one of those if you're in programming, you probably know who he is. If you don't, that's very surprising. He's basically one of the most prolific and well-known programmers there is. Worked on quite a lot of things from
the origin of most 3D gaming stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
a lot of the mobile stuff, the VR stuff, and all kinds of other things.
And And to clarify, it's not that he was first; he came up with the techniques that other people are using.
Yeah, like literally the smooth scrolling on PC was him for like side scrolling games, basically from a lot of stuff.
As a
He tried to-
teenager.
Yes, as a teenager, he tried to sell Nintendo back their own license. So it's a whole lot of. He's got a lot of really fun stories in his past. But either way, he's well known dev. He worked on a lot of foundational technology for stuff, and like literally made VR faster because of the way he worked on stuff. Anyway, he's got a lot of strong opinions. Some people like him, some people don't. But one thing that was particularly interesting was he's very speed and user focused. A lot of his opinions come from the perspective that things should be efficient, fast, and as user friendly as possible, but from a programmer's mindset. And so that has pros and cons, right? Like his view, for example, on this was to do with UI. And when it comes to UI, the broad principle being there's a button, and if you have a button that does something, it can act either when you press down, and then it'll activate on
The
pressing
instant.
the button, or you release and it activates on release. And the web standard, if you use on click as an event action, is actually click doesn't do the action, release does the action. You don't think of it that way, but if you click most buttons on most websites and you click on the button, it won't activate till your mouse clicks up. It's basically on down or on press is separate from the on click. And his argument is that it should be the other way around. In general, things should activate when you click them, not when you release them. And I'm vaguely of the same mindset, but it is funny how it actually led to a pretty interesting set of strong opinions on both sides. So.
Yeah. So just to expand a bit about on this, the idea is that acting instantly gives you a more responsive reaction from whatever you're trying to interact with, which means you can get doing what you're wanting to do faster. There is a lot of delay if you accumulate clicking on release, because a lot of people like fat finger, or they don't instantly ballistically tap the button on their mouse. It's impossible for them to not add a delay to what they're doing, so it lowers quality of life. Now, there is the argument to acting on release, which is if you get a misclick happening and you had not yet left the action, you can actually drag off the button and release, and then the action will not occur. This is also how we get features like dragging things in a browser, because if you had acted on a link when you click it, you would not be able to drag it, which is not ideal in some cases. So for regular applications, this actually lets you correct misuse or wrong acting. Problem being that it also lowers the speed at which you interact with things. And if you try to have both for actions that only have like one purpose, you cannot have consistency. So let's say if button only has one action, you act on mouse down. But if you have multiple actions, you'll act on mouse up. Now you can't be consistent about what you have. Users will see that some buttons react faster than others.
I will say one thing to kind of play both sides. The most compelling reason why people give for the release option is if you're doing something like a purchase on a website or verifying some action that's a submit of some kind of form, people don't realize they do this, but they always have the check the doors before they leave the house moment, where once you click the mouse down, that's suddenly when the alarm bells go off in your head. You're holding the mouse in a frozen state and you just scan the page real quickly to make sure that everything went okay. And if something is wrong or you forgot to fill something in or the price isn't what you expect it to be, that's the exact moment you drag the mouse off the button, let go, and then take a sigh of relief. People don't realize they do this, but that's they treat that as the moment that they kind of process information. Now, my argument is that's a silly practice, and just like with most things, you should learn not to do it that moment, because that gives you a very tiny window of verification. But it is how people think, and I've done it myself. It's sort of a natural reaction. It's the classic when you're a kid and you pick up a chess piece and you're told, no, you can't just pick up a piece, put it back down, change your mind. Once you've chosen something, you have to engage with the choice you've made. So yeah, it's an argument I understand it, but I'm firmly in the other camp. I believe that philosophically it should be action when you press it, and I think that it leads to overall more reactive design, with the caveats that there are certain use cases, and one in particular I mentioned is, for me, it's down to the reality of reaction timing. So one example I've given, which I do think is a very fair case for the release, is if you're at like a funfair type scenario and there's a big button and the button's meant to fire something at a certain timer where you're trying to hit a target. If you've never pressed this button, especially a tactile or haptic button, you have no concept of one, how much force it's going to take, or two, where the actuation point is on the button you're pressing, which means if you're trying to time something up to pressing a button, pressing it down is not going to give you the feedback at the exact moment, and you'll probably miss where you're aiming. So in those cases, I find it's more relaxing and satisfying to press it down, hold, and then you can put all your attention into focusing on the timing and release, because release has a lower delay time between you engaging with your choice versus releasing. Those scenarios make sense to me, where you're pressing and the release is the engagement, because that's now shorter. But in most cases, mouse clicks, etc., there is no giant weight on sort of a more physical or haptic button, and so for me, that should be just a click. But yeah, again, it's definitely a larger, more contentious point than I thought it was.
Yeah, there is also another thing here where he mentioned in this post, if you scroll down a bit, that game developers with simple UI toolkits tend to get this right more often. I thought about this a lot, and I realized that this is mostly due to if you have a simple UI toolkit, which means you don't have a lot of options, it's usually hard-coded such that it's primitive. You don't have the concept of dragging usually. And if you don't have the concept of dragging, you have like the concept of on start the action and on end the action. And you actually have to maintain a selection of sorts. So it's far easier to say, actually, you know what? As soon as I know that mouse left is clicked here and you are within this rectangle, just make the action happen. And this is actually ironically how Terraria used to work. And we had a big discussion about this, I think, a few years ago, where we kind of wanted to do the cancelable stuff, and then we were like, it's actually less responsive, like trying to handle your inventory, etc. So it gets pretty complicated, because if you have a clickable action, you don't want the game to start like not acting properly, especially if players are used to sliding their cursor a lot. So yeah.
Plus, I think part of it too is well, you're right that a lot of frameworks or things will start that way by default as well, with the exception that web has the standard for that because of what you mentioned with drag and drop and various other like compound actions. If you're to try to do something similar yourself for your own game, for example, some kind of combo system, if you ever try to write your own combo system, the short answer is if things activated when you press the button, you can't combo, at least not initially, because you're going to activate the first thing you press. So there has to be some level of you have some timer and some release, and it gets, or sequence pattern matching, and it gets into a lot of stuff where it becomes more complicated to have to decide these things, like how long certain delays on release to count a combo has ended. There's lots of other little edge cases that, well, it's possible and you can make things quite fast. It's more compounding of a problem, and so most solutions just favor the on click do thing.
Yeah. So on the topic of just making a choice here, I'm firmly still in John Carmack's side. I still believe that having an instant click is better than not having it, with the idea that alternative actions should be done on the basis of right clicking, as opposed to like dragging or being cancelable at all. Because if you had not clicked anything, it's easier for everyone. There is actually one interesting case that I try to check with almost every game that I play in the past few years when I interact with the UI, which is what happens when I click and is it instant? So just as an example, Genshin Impact, popular game, has very few fancy buttons that will actually have like animated effects when you are starting to click on them. Now, those effects are for selection and deselection. I think they're using the standard Unity button stuff, because there is no like direct state management for getting onto a button and off a button with your cursor while holding, like starting the action, leaving it, and letting it be. And in those cases, I find that there are a lot of visual bugs. Like they literally don't plan for this. Which is a very interesting case, because they have the functionality, but the visuals will get stuck on like a certain state. So they really don't expect users to be doing this. They're just allowing the option to have it.
I think broadly with my solution, the same thing. I've landed on the Carmack side too, but for a different reason. I think from a fully empathetic perspective, the argument of I like to have that last minute check and verification is a perfectly sound panic-driven response. But my argument is, if that happens to you, that's usually one of two things. Either the information is not clear enough that you felt confident in your click the first time, or you're not paying attention enough in terms of engaging with the information such that you click has made you confident. In either case, I think it's either a matter of other problems, either an unclear UI or dark patterns or something that's designed to confuse you, or you're not engaging with information. In either case, the solution to me is not this sort of conceptual small window of panic that may or may not save you on a rare case you click the right thing at the right time. I think people like having it because it's there, but I do think that it's not I don't want to design around it as a baked-in feature, to put it politely. I don't think that's a good design choice as an ongoing thing. But I can understand for web because it's already a standard. I wouldn't want to remove it because it would be the kind of thing that might panic people. Because the worst thing you can do is completely change standards, right? If there's an existing standard, at least stick with what's there. But principally for games especially, it's more important to have feedback. So I'm very much a fan. And I also bake that in, by the way. It's a small thing, but keep in mind too where Carmack comes from. He's someone who's worked on games and worked in VR and worked in interactability stuff, which means a lot of his feedback and opinions is going to come from that era of stuff. Web designers might have a completely different opinion, and you kind of have to choose one or the other from like the philosophy side of it. And so I believe where I think he's coming from, I agree with. I would put more caveats in because I've done some web stuff more, and I don't know how much Carmack has done, and I think there's arguments to be made philosophically, but broadly the actual principles behind what he's saying I agree with.
There is one more topic I'd like to bring up in regards to delays, which is the delay action on drag, which is something that I see forming in specific menus for some games. So, for example, in games where you can manage a team, there would be the ability to click and then drag the cursor out of the frame of your original button to deploy some unit or switch the position of two units that are deployed. But I'm seeing more and more games adding a little UI circle for like progress of waiting until we actually start a drag action. And I don't know why they're adding it. I don't see the utility of that as opposed to like drag out. I assume on a very small level that it's saying, hey, we're about to enter a drag action. If you don't want it, cancel now. But why?
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is to let people know that it can be drug if they don't know they can drag things already. Like,
Yeah, but
they don't realize that it's draggable for those people. But other than that, I got nothing.
If it were instant, though, you could immediately like show the drag, icon. Like if you're playing Diablo and you're starting to drag an item out, it immediately becomes like a silhouette of the item card on your cursor. But in other games, it would be like, wait. Now you get the silhouette.
Yeah, I had one other question on this delay stuff, just on the design side for all of you. When it comes to buttons in games, so not like actual actions, but just menus and stuff, do you always still do you go with like the same where it's action on press, or do you kind of go with the release and for the visual part, or do you put in an extra little delay there for the visuals if the action is going to be something that's going to change the screen? So like say you're clicking a button, the screen's going to change. Do you like to show some animation there, have a little bit of a delay before it instantly responds? Or I'm curious what you guys all do. I mean, I know
I admit I've been on that one.
Go ahead.
Good point. It's just saying that for that is a good point. Is I hadn't heard it until you've said it, but for things like pressing the start or continue button on a title screen, I'll go against my own rules there purely from a flourish perspective. I do think there's something very satisfying about having a press down, which has some visual flourish, and then release has some sound effect and the screen fades out. Because that is more of again, it's like using font choices, right? There's like fonts that would represent dramatic titles versus the ones that would be text. I do think there's given that a lot of like title screen stuff is a lot more visual flourish. I don't mind that because once you've clicked continue, there's no real you're either going or you're not, right? And it's usually this idea, and without getting too meta into the whole like narrative side of it, the fact of the matter is a fade to black is canonically narrative storytelling wise meant to be a passage of time. That's why that particular transition effect is chosen. And so using like press continue, especially more so than new game, represents continuing a journey. I think there's a lot of visual flourish you can do at the beginning of that, where you press it, you play a sound, you fade out and fade in again. You can like it sort of sets people in a mindset for continuing a journey. But that's like micro use case storytelling stuff that I don't think is but I agree. There's those kinds of scenarios where it's more visual flourish than anything else.
You just gave me very harmful memories from the time of Destiny 2 and having to manually wait for a little cursor thing every time you wanted to change an inventory item. Virtual cursors in consoles are a menace.
Oh yeah, the whole circle thing drives me insane. That one in particular, for me that was the Kinect. Anytime you had to say, "Oh, let's use the Kinect as an input device," so hold your hand up for 5 minutes just to highlight.
You're practicing being Iron Man, damn it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there were a couple other topics that I had queued up that I wanted to talk about today. Anybody have a preference on where we start, or you go ahead?
Yeah, I didn't get to say my piece on the.
Sorry.
Delayed action. No, it's fine. It's fine. So, in regards to delayed actions, once you have clicked the button, I generally try to minimize that as much as possible, to the point where I would even let actions happen before the visual has shown up, if I can help it. So, for example, if there is a button that makes another menu appear, and the menu is going to have buttons in the exact same place every time, I will let the buttons already react before the animation even finishes, and I'll make sure the animation is extremely quick. The reason I want to do this is because hyper-optimizing users will appreciate this kind of feature. It's particularly more notorious in console games, where you know the button sequence you have to click to reach submenu. And if you have to wait every time, you're wasting so much of the user's time and potentially respect for the game, because they'll get bored trying to interact with whatever they need. Now, there is a case for minimizing inventory actions in general, but if you're playing a heavy game like an RPG or JRPG, you want to interact with the menus a lot. You need to make sure it's a good experience. There's actually a very interesting study case, I think, for this with the Hyperdimension Neptunia games. I've played all of them in sequence, and they are JRPGs, and every time they change how the menus look. And in the first game and second game, it's relatively responsive, but the third game comes in, and I played this specifically on the PS Vita, I think, and the buttons there are immediate. Like you can feel that you can already interact with anything before anything shows up. Like I can press start AA down A, and I can get like to the submenu I wanted immediately, and I don't even get to see anything except like the screen blurring and immediately reaching the point where I actually wanted to be. And it's such a great experience when you're actually trying to do things quickly, especially if you're getting in and finding a lot of items in the field, and then you want to equip them, and like, oh, I found a sword, immediately go in and like equip it. Now, you could argue for like a smart action of like press square to immediately equip it, but if you have multiple members that can equip different items, then you want to start like manually managing it.
I would say though that's like by this stage we're a million miles past the button problem into the user experience design, because this conversation can go really deep into that. For example, I agree with you on principle, but I do think that there's so many examples of I think principally the point of this argument is to say that whenever you press a button, if you're capable of reacting immediately, react immediately in some fashion. That's just generally the broad thing here. Do something, even if it's just play a sound to acknowledge the press. The fact is people need to know that their action did something. What happens next, that's more philosophically around user experience. What I mean is like there's a whole load of studies on the idea of loading content and information, and how for power user stuff like you're describing, that sort of like nested menu stuff is great. But in contrast, for people asking a question to a system, if it responds immediately with, say, cached information, that's mentally jarring for a lot of people, because they're used to the idea that a question is processed. And they often feel like, did my action go through? Did something finish? And so there's a cost benefit on that in terms of how that evaluates. Not to mention, again, like I said, from a narrative or time processing where some level of delay matters. And I'm not saying like the full boring delay. And also, separate from all of that, there's the processing of how we imagine delays versus real delays. A good example of this is you could have a 2-second delay or 3-second delay between activating a menu and showing a menu. But if you show the menu from off screen and it slides up into place, that's going to feel longer because you're going to see more visual passage of time versus the more correct solution where you actually show it at about here and then you fade it out so it's completely invisible and it fades in and coasts into position at the same time. So your perception of time is, instead of this event occurring, that event occurs. It could be the exact same duration of time, but your perception of time is different because the animation leads your eye in a way that's a lot more efficient and matches your eye line. So long story short, this is more than just a like button press conversation past that point. And so there's a lot more nuance, and it's use case based. And is it a power user thing? Is it a frequent use like a menu subnesting? Is it like a one-time press to start an adventure? Is it a sleep at camp where you want to literally demonstrate time passing by having some, all of these things come into play past that point. So yeah, I do want to differentiate between act on button press versus the philosophical design choices of what a button does and how it plays into design,
Yeah, there is also the case for when you have these actions and you give these delays in the display, there are actually a lot of technical difficulties, because if you have a game where you make a coroutine and you're saying from 0 to 100, make the opacity go up, and my camera just died. It's dying quite a bit. So if you make the opacity go up, and you want to cancel that, you can't just leave the opacity where it was, and you can't just start moving to another menu from full opacity, because now the UI will flicker from like half to a full and then back down. So what you want to do is to be able to cancel and like immediately transition to the correct value. But a lot of systems from built-in engines like Unity, Unreal, etc., they don't provide that to you. If you have full control of the code, you can kind of do that. But if you're using like a Unity animation, the Unity animation doesn't exactly have the tools to make a value always go to the right space, especially if you write defaults in Unity's animator, which is available on the regular buttons.
And one final thing on that, with the going back to the idea of the sort of cancel option where people have the panic, oh no, I made a mistake. Again, without getting super meta into details, to me, that's not a UI question. That is what's called a transactional question, where whenever you click an action, you start a transaction. If there's a reason for you wanting to cancel a transaction, that should be an option. A lot of database systems, for example, will send your request to do something like a purchase and have a timestamp to it, and they'll actually have a mild delay before engaging with it. And that means that if within a few seconds of you choosing to respond and hit the cancel, they can unhook it from the stack collection of things they're doing. Not all systems do this, but it's like a better example would, and it's even just simple removal like text. If you send a text message, theoretically you can send an undo to just basically remove it from the stack for it's displayed in other devices. There's a lot of this stuff, and again, it comes down to preferences or whether you're doing multi-compound actions or whatever. So my point again is to say that's not a button issue. If undoing a transaction needs to be an option available to you, it should be available to you, rather than being did you happen to hold the button for the right duration to uncancel yourself or whatever.
On the flip side, if it's like, hey, are you sure you want to do this, for the option to cancel, it's adding double the work for every action that you're trying to do, which you're going to get numb to that extra click, and you're just going to start doing it automatically, and then it's losing its purpose.
Well, yeah, but again, it goes back to like each action from like a web design perspective. You're talking about calls to action versus your like, what is the unit for the page? If you're setting up a whole lot of stuff and then you click commit or like start game, I'm not going to do it on every choice you make, but I am going to do it on the begin adventure and select the thing you did after spending 15 minutes designing stuff. That action is like is a completion action that you might want to have someone have the option to undo at that phase, separate from the others.
Absolutely, Phil. Should we move to the next topic?
Sure. Sounds good. I mean, I've got lots of UI inside already and button inside. So yeah, let's jump over to project structure. There are a couple people in chat already asking about it, and some asking what it means to structure a game. And Tailwind's asking if you should do some videos about it. I'd say definitely. There are probably, I think, very few videos out there on how people structure their games and how they put them together. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion. It also varies a lot, I think, from game type to game type. So I think maybe when we're talking about it, we should specify for the specific platforms and or game types or varieties of things, because I mean some things build a little bit different. Welcome, Andrew. Looks like
hello
Greg's internet died on the road. Didn't get to
Oh.
talk much, but he got to join and scare a lot of people, at least, who all thought he was driving while I was sitting there. Anyway, yeah, we're gonna jump into project structure stuff. So I know you've got a project as well that you've been working on. And
I do.
others, so be interesting to see where everybody is. Lots of different ideas on how you should structure your assets, code, everything else, and then also thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about just kind of game flow structuring too, how you all prefer to set that up. You get in, there's some entry point into the game. Do you keep it simple? Do you have a standard setup for that? Does it vary based on the platforms and the type of thing as well? So yeah, I guess we'll just start with who has an interesting one. Anybody have like a big strong thoughts and opinions on this?
I have a lot of thoughts about this because I've tried multiple projects across the years with Unity, and I've always ended up bashing the current way I'm doing things and saying next time it's gonna be way better.
Yeah.
So let me just start you off on the journey. So Unity recommends that you split it by asset types. So you have a folder for scripts, you have a folder for materials, you have a folder for textures, models, and then prefabs, usually. The basic things, audio, obviously. Now, within those folders, you can start having separation by feature, like this belongs to a squirrel and this belongs to a cat in terms of audio or textures or whatever. And then when you're working on creating the thing, you always access whatever is relevant within the same hierarchical structure. So you have prefabs, squirrels, red squirrel, and then you have materials, squirrel, red squirrel, material. This works fine until things start sharing content. I used to be a fan of the idea of separate by feature, which means if I am adding a red squirrel, I'm just going to have content, red squirrel, material, prefab, texture, etc.
And maybe scripts under there too, or no?
So scripts would be like usually an entirely different thing, because you won't necessarily have a red squirrel script. So I would put all the scripts in one spot with their own folders, obviously. But based on the features that they have instead of the content that they show, I have no idea why my camera is dying. Sorry. So
Probably overheating. That's what mine used to do.
no,
Yeah.
it's chill. So anyways, I used to be a fan of the by feature, but this does not work as soon as things start sharing content. And the more content that you have, the more you'll find yourself wanting things to share content. So it's kind of a cursed road. So I don't have a good path to solve that. I did end up appreciating Unity's way more than my own, specifically because it makes things easy. But you need tooling around it, because trying to find things and having duplicate subfolders is a pain. It's an absolute pain. So I would have buttons to say create subfolders that match this type of content, and when I rename a path, try to rename all matching subpaths. And that is also a cursed type of problem to have, because now if things rely on those paths, like you hard-coded some path in your code, and you're changing one thing and it's changing the other thing, everything is going to the trash. So I usually have like, hey, if I know that there is a shared thing that some script is accessing by path, I'm going to make sure that path is always consistent, at least to a constant string variable in my code, so I can know I can change it and it fixes everything that's using that kind of path. Not always the easiest thing to do. So this is for the files, at least. Anybody else got thoughts on assets?
I can go back and forth, especially when I'm producing stuff for the asset store. If it's just a single character, then splitting things by material, textures, etc. makes a lot of sense. But once I have, especially like a package of 50 armor pieces, suddenly it doesn't really make sense to do it like that. So there's really different ways I'll do it in the end. But to the point of, yeah, I don't want to search for squirrel and find 10 different squirrel folders. I have in the past, I think a long time ago, named things squirrel material, squirrel texture, squirrel this, which solves that, but it's kind of verbose. But in the end, I think it's a little bit of a personal preference, unless you're working on a team. If you're working on a team, then it's a team preference. But of just how best you go about searching and finding things, I suppose.
So in your game, what do you do? Like, what's your current strategy? It doesn't have to be the perfect, but what's your current? How do you kind of lay it out?
I can, I can show, not tell here.
Screen share it. All right.
Let me
behind the scenes.
Yeah. So this is the current. Is it working? Let's see.
Yeah.
This is the current view, and you can see over here. I have. Let's just collapse everything. We have assets, which includes not only one Infinity PBR, but also a second Infinity PBR script, because some got imported to this one. Some have the new Infinity PBR Magic Pig Games name, so we got imported there. You have other asset publisher stuff up here. I have an asset store folder that has some asset store folder stuff, but not all of them because I haven't moved them over.
Okay.
I have whatever this folder is, which is old, but I need it because I might copy stuff from there. So I have that.
It's RPG project with prefabs, huh?
With prefabs, and these are old prefabs that I'm going to end up copying because I'm going to need them, but I'm probably going to have to update them a little bit. So this is from the last version, and only I know that. Nobody else knows that.
Don't let it out, anybody.
PR stuff. You got Nature Manufacturer assets right there, organized in one place. Then we get to the Legend of the Stones. So I have a Legend of the Stones folder for the project I'm currently working on, and then we have.
So this is the actual game folder.
Yeah, we have it mostly split out by types. When it comes to prefabs, I've got subfolders for enemies, etc. Different types of prefabs. I have the scripts set. A whole bunch of different subfolders for scripts, but then those will all have a small number of different things. And so generally I try to do it like this in the end.
You reminded me of something that I am compelled to say right now.
Do it.
Why don't you have a subfolder for your game at the top?
Well, he has that in the middle there. It's
because
the Legend of the Stones one is his game subfolder,
but
it's just not at the top.
You could say that I should put some underscores, or I guess what's here? Why is this above?
The number
3 comes before RPG. Okay.
3 comes before underscore.
So yeah, underscore. I just haven't done that yet. I might eventually. Yeah.
So this is the kind of thing where it's mostly for convenience purposes, because when you import new assets into a project, you have no degree of control over where they import, especially in the older Unity Asset Store standards, where a folder could just import things wherever, or it could create assets wherever from scripts, because some would say like, at the root directory of the project, under assets, create a scriptable object if it is missing, and every time you try to move it, you're just creating another one. This is like one of the most cursed scenarios that you can find, and this is a good way to separate from that, because if you have your stuff there and other people are making new stuff there, you can't separate anymore, and it becomes a mess to find your own stuff.
Yeah. So I do for the Infinity PBR stuff, I do use underscores to bring up the characters to the top, and then to bring the prefabs to the top, figuring that's what most people are going to be looking for when they open it up for the very first time. So I do that, and that keeps them all organized. And the reason they're named like this is because I have my own little tool that brings in the main package for the project. I have a tool that brings them in and out based on the name, and so that's why they're named like this. But there you go.
Nice. It's good to get a view into somebody's project.
Yeah.
And we got another face here. You gonna say hello, Alon?
Hey guys, how's it going?
Good. We're
So-
just talking about project structure, folders, kind of how we like to build things, and just different ways to build things as well, and kind of structure the entire project. Andrew was just kindly sharing his actual project and showing us what it was like. So if you've got thoughts on this, or I don't know, Story's been thinking about it for a while, feel free to.
I have a very large rant appearing, so I'm leaving it to last because
I
I have a lot of very
say,
angry thoughts on this topic.
I was about to say, if you guys got out the pitchforks yet, it's just like one of those topics where you guys have some
Yeah,
religious
well,
arguments.
I feel like a lot of the time people don't really get to see very many other real projects. It's rare that you get to see like behind the scenes of people's real projects and see how they're put together. So, yeah, if you've got thoughts, like different ways, things that you've seen work well, Yorai had a lot of good insights into things that work well, and then also some of the downsides and problems that come. Yorai, got more?
Yeah, I
mean,
actually have more when you mentioned it, but yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I was just saying there's only one way to do it, obviously, right? You have to-
Yeah, do it the right way.
the right way. No, I'm kidding. I think for me, it depends on if you're using packages or not, really, right? Because if you can use packages in your project, you should use packages and keep things into the appropriate package. And then within that package, hopefully it is small enough that you can then separate out the way that the classic way of like, material folder, texture folder, runtime folder, editor folder. And you don't let your packages get so big that you need to start thinking about, okay, I need a bunch of subfolders. But if you do have like, let's say, a package for major features, I think you can, and you think about how to architect your project so that things are separate enough and you have appropriate dependencies between things, then you can get a nicely arranged project without having to think too much about how to do the folder structure.
In regards to major features, how would you define a major feature as opposed to a smaller feature?
Well, it's about who's working on it. So if you can say, okay, I have, let's say a small squad of people. I have a designer, a developer, and a artist working together on a feature. Let's say it is the UI for the game or something. Can those people then operate more quickly if their stuff is a little bit isolated from everybody else's? And so then you can group their things together. They can operate on that. And if you have the proper project structure, you can say, okay, here's where we're going to interface with the UI. Here's the way that we're going to do it. Then those people can operate a little bit independently of everybody else. And they can even, this is extreme. You don't usually want to have a bunch of different styles in one project, but you could say, okay, because you guys are operating independently, you guys can do things a little bit differently than the other team.
Okay, that's one way to look into it. I would say that in a world where you work with less folders, you'll have less of this problem because people will be working on individual files. So it depends on like how much indenting you want to go within your project structure. On that note, I've failed to mention how Terraria actually does it, which is a very simple design. We have a resources folder. Everything gets dropped under that resources folder. We have a specific on the root folder, almost all the content goes. And then we have like some more specific things for isolated features that no other feature will share the assets of. One problem that would happen with that is if we want to start using something from there, unilaterally, like we have a noise texture, things will want to use that noise texture for, I don't know, an enemy effect, a background effect, a UI shader thing. When that happens, I would recommend moving it to a different position. One important note here is in the code, there is only one line that loads that resource, which means if we move it, nothing else needs to get updated. And this is a good thing for the most part that Unity already handles for you, because Unity gives you fields with dropdowns and it manages GUIDs for all the assets, which means if an asset moves, it still keeps the same GUID and you can still bind it to the proper place. The only place where this doesn't work is if you're using addressables and you're packaging your content. Because now, if two things are pointing to the same addressable, the same asset from two different addressables, you'll be duplicating that asset. And that is fine for the most part, but it means you're double loading the asset, which is a memory waste, which sometimes can go wrong horribly. Yeah. And one more thing. There are plenty of different games on Steam that are like really popular, and you can actually go to the game local folder and see how they manage things. In particular, a recent thing that came up in discussions with others is that Hades and Hades 2 have their source files as well. Kind of shared. It's specifically Lua, so sandbox scripting, but it's
Okay.
most of the content of the game. So you can see that for their code as well.
Oh, nice. I think it's always fun and interesting to see other projects. And then also just it's interesting when you get in and see projects and see that almost none of them are perfect. Some of them that have a good team that have been working for a long time tend to get pretty tight and pretty good. But most, I would say more than 50% of projects see, especially early on, they're not ideal. Like,
Yeah,
they're not as pretty as you're expecting sometimes.
And to be fair, nobody's looking at it. People are looking
Yeah.
at the game, the product, not how it
Yeah.
was structured, unless they're either competing or trying to mod it. And games that do mod support tend to just let people see and say, this is fine. We created the game, you enjoyed the game, you will deal with whatever comes next. For the record, Terraria itself has an ID for the items, and there are a lot of furniture sets, and one of the furnitures is a spider furniture set, and one of the items is a sink that comes with every furniture set. The ID for it is spider sink does whatever a spider sink does. So-
Oh. All right, story.
Okay, you
Everybody's
ready to
kind
brace
of ready
yourselves?
for the rant. So
This isn't a small one, so just be prepared. Let me just start by saying that, like in most things in life, people often tackle the same problems and sort of imagine they're unique. But in practice, this entire area is literally a field of study called information retrieval theory, as in, like, anywhere anyone needs to get stuff, how do you design stuff to be gotten, is effectively broadly it's a huge area of study. People have spent a lot of time researching and working on this, and without going into too much detail, the short answer is Unity is not a folder structure, it is an asset database. And I put a big asterisk there, and I say this all of the time, and that's really a big deal. It's a big deal because people think about this wrong. And what I mean by that is there is a concept in information retrieval theory called facet navigation. Facet navigation means when you're trying to get something, there's multiple ways with which you can engage with getting that thing. You either want to get it temporally, in other words, when is the most recent thing versus the oldest thing. You want to get it spatially, where is this thing related to other things. You want to get it thematically, so where is this related to this topic we talked about, like folders or categories or dragons or groups, or taxonomically or categorically, where you're basically saying there's tags, so this is all of this stuff vaguely to do with fire, regardless of where they're associated, etc. Now, that may sound like a lot, but the fact of the matter is we live in a world that's transcended the generic folder structure. We live in a world where you can engage with stuff at multiple axes simultaneously. And so my point is the folder structure literally doesn't matter at this level of answer. The fact is you should be able to access anything you want, any way you want, in whatever way makes sense for your project. And the practical implications of this is you can have folders if you want, tags if you want, filters if you want, naming convention if you want, as long as you can hit these 4 tiers of access of information. And that supports every possible combination of ways in which you need to find or engage with something. Now, Unity's native support for this is literally labels. You can label any asset. And there's actually filters that you can either type into the search box, or if you want to get extra fancy, you can literally put a search context attribute above a field that's normally supposed to provide an object and provide the filter that tells you exactly only show things in this folder with this tag, with this label, or with this whatever. And you can get as specific as you like. So my point is, if there are things you need to access semi-regularly, pre-bake filters and support the way to access them at different axes. Now, this means that, like in my case, if I know that getting all weapons is one thing, or getting all placeable props is another, or getting all systems is another, or getting all things that are considered in progress or test versus all things that are finished, I just come up with a set of conventions that these are, I put the keyword experiment whenever it's not production ready. I put the keyword prefab when it's like a placeable thing in the scene. And I just give myself a means to access all those things in whatever capacity makes sense for my project, which finally gets to the last part, which is the idea of folders. How should you structure your folders? Well, aside from the obvious correct, have some sort of underscore root so that your stuff is separate from assets, the secondary thing is the goal of that is separate. Do not structure your folders to facilitate search, because again, it's not a search system. It's an asset database where you should search. If you're engaging with folders, you're engaging with them for a different reason, which is modification or movement of assets for the perspective of either deleting, modifying, or sharing. And so my point is, folder structure should be to facilitate things that can be either added to, deleted from, or moved in a way that supports either updating files or things. In other words, what traditionally supports artist workflows. So I will structure my folders in that sort of thematic structure we described, where it's like, here's all of the stuff for one area, which has all of these types of creatures, which is all of these things, not because it's search facilitating, but because that means in the event one item gets deleted or moved or modified, there is a place to do it. And even all this stuff I talk about, I'm using something called Directory Opus locally, which means I can literally run these queries in my Explorer, and I can actually filter the objects live and modify them with the same level of asset database management in my file system. So for me, I can treat any file system like a search and then get the exact things and then make compound searches and run automations, because I think that way across all my stuff. Most people don't have those tools on their machine. But either way, if I was to just summarize the whole lot again, my point is there's two categories of grouping. There's searching, and then there's like this modification of assets. Modification of assets support the easiest way to add or delete. For searching, do not structure around searching. Searching is a different problem, and you use the tools available to you to perform searching. And then you figure out what searches are regular, you group that together, and you give yourself tools to do that. When I work with artists, for example, I will give them pre-filtered queries saying, click this button if you want all the plant stuff, click this button if you want all the rock stuff, click this button if you want all the level 1 stuff. And I can even pre-automate this that'll generate and give them lists, and it's literally just with tags. And as long as people are diligent putting tags on it, it'll work. And if even people aren't diligent with tags, you can have certain drop folders, which will have automatic tag applications so that when they drop stuff into the right folders, it'll get the right tags. So, well, even though folders might be used in that case to facilitate the search, they are not for the search. They are as a means of ingesting information, which is a whole different technical problem. So you joked earlier about there not being a right answer. I think there is a right answer, and I think that's the right answer in my opinion.
I've got a question on that. Have you tried that with teams of other developers though, and have you been able to get buy-in on them actually using searching and kind of following the same systems that
I've noticed that 90% of people will not use half of it because it's too confusing, but that's fine, because what I'll do, like everything else I talk about, I will go to the one or two people who need to do a certain thing a lot. For example, I worked with an audio designer, and they're like, I don't know how to get the audio stuff. And I said, okay, I will write you 4 queries, and I will show you where the button is in Unity, and here's 4 queries. This one will get you all the audio files. This is how you search and filter by them. And then what I even did, because what's really cool is Unity's search box will let you provide a grid, which will have certain fields. So I made a button for him where he clicked the button and it showed in the active scene all the audio sources and all the volumes, all the attenuations, all of the on or offs, all of the mutes, all of the whatever, because I know when he's going to go and mix and modify stuff, he's not looking in scenes. He doesn't want a hierarchy dragged down. He wants to see a list of all of the audio sources and modify their sliders. So I will basically, it's more work for me, but like the short answer is no, everyone doesn't have to engage with every part of every system. You can just go to a person and say, you only need these things. If I know you're not going to do it, I'll set up your thing for you and I'll show you a magic button. I did the same thing with scenes. I built a custom drop down based off of the one we talked about before with Dave's option. I built a thing that's like scenes. You do a drop down and it picks scenes. And then I had it automatically use the folder structure to say if the scene contains the word audio or fmod, move it into the audio folder. If the scene name contains the word experiment or temp or is in the experiment folder, move it into the experiment subdirectory. If it has a person's name in it, move it to that name directory. That way, when people want to look for scenes, they're not like, where did you put that scene? They go to the scenes button, which shows a drop down, which shows a list of names of people on the staff, which then has subfolders. And then in the case of like test or experiments, they're all in there. And so people don't have to, you don't have to think about it. It's just, it's organized based on that particular philosophy. Yeah.
So I got a scenario in my head I want to run by you. So imagine, I'm just thinking back to like a Sony day. So you're on the on a team, there's 20 engineers all working in code alongside the designers and artists and all the other stuff that you'd be building some of these tools for. But you're bringing in new developers constantly, and they're cycling out. Do you think that the folder structure is helpful there for bringing those new people, or you think you can just get everybody into using labels and the same kind of searching stuff? That's more of where I was thinking, like they're going in, they need to add a system, fix a bug or whatever, and they need to know where should this go, where's the code that's related to it. Well, do you think labels and stuff and searching things are enough, or is there more that you would do, or is there a way that you kind of would use those to make that stuff more discoverable and manageable, I guess? Sorry.
Well, okay. My answer to that is twofold. One is that the folder structure does exist by the sheer nature of a folder structure has to exist. It will be there. Two, I did say structure it basically based on the thematics, which means there will still be the level 1 contains objects A's, which like that's there if that's your baseline and you don't engage with any other part of the system. That's just a
but what about the code side of that, I guess? Like the actual scripts for that? Are they in like, are you thinking more feature-based like we were talking, or?
I do feature-based, but I will, like Uri said, scripts are, because they're literally processed differently and often have different rules like asset definitions, I do have a scripts folder, but then in there I will retain a very similar structured hierarchy of what's there.
Like a feature set, like per feature or per system,
normally there's like a common followed by either areas or important parts of the map followed by units, or like I call them actors. So there's like actor sets, and then you have stuff which is like static or managers, and I'll kind of go down that road. But again, I try to convince people not to use that way. If that's the way they work, that's fine. But let me just say one thing on that is that a lot of people will say, yeah, that's confusing, people won't use it. And I'm like, you know what, that's fine, because as a contractor, I've worked on lots of people's projects and I get to see how lots of people organize it. And the short answer is, like a lot of people have pointed out, the answer is they don't. They panic, they keep working, and they let stuff go. And that's perfectly fine, because that's what really happens. And my point here isn't to say that there's a perfect right answer for a folder structure. I'm saying we all eventually give up on tidiness to get work done. And what I'm saying is, if you try to keep managing the ultimate folder structure, you will fail. But if you don't think that way at all, and instead think in terms of questions, and then structure your data to be able to answer questions, you'll have a much easier time, because then the answer is put it wherever makes sense as you go. And then if you tell me, oh crap, wouldn't it be nice if we have a button that found all of the rocks that happen to have moss on them? I could be like, give me a second and I'll make a rocks with moss button, and I will then have and it doesn't affect any folder structure whatsoever. And people who care about the moss with rocks thing, or there's a button there to do it. And my point is, you can do that organically as a project grows. You can have a thing that's like that filter that we care about at this point in time. Now, is there some overhead in terms of tagging? Yes, but I guarantee you, if you get people on board with the idea that at some point they need to find a certain thing and they can make a magical answer filter for it, people will very easily get used to the idea of tagging. They won't like it, but they like that a lot more than that inherent panic that happens halfway through a project lifecycle, where people's like, is this version 7 of the material, or is this the right one because it's called mat_floor, and is it that mat floor or that mat floor? Other people's philosophies aren't working for them. And so is the whole idea that my solution might have flaws is fine, but the point is, I'm coming at it from, you can search through any level of facet navigation by the concept of information theory. There's loads of ways to engage with it through my system because the tools are built to support that. But if you're living entirely in folder structure land, you have to get it right the first time, and you're screwed if you don't. That's, I think, is a fallacious way to think, because you're giving yourself problems that you can't get out of if you try to solve it, as opposed to if you try to engage with it as information and different axes of information. It's just a different way to think, is my point.
Can I?
Yeah, go for it. All right, we all can see the thoughts just waiting to come out.
Okay, so multiple things to go through. First, somebody in the comments said that with all due respect, tooling is not project structure. Project structure comes first. This is absolutely false. You first figure out what you need to make, and then you figure out what actually matters within it, and then you decide your project structure based on that and the related tooling. Because if you get a tool that says no project structure matters, you don't care about the project structure anymore. For example, if we can, by the nature of assets existing, determine everything about them, like say the name, etc., we don't need a project structure that says that we care about the name. Like these days we have AI that can immediately extract facts about what the asset contains. So we have the ability to ignore project structure or structure things differently than structure a project differently based on what tools we're planning to have or planning to support. Secondly, Jason, you mentioned that in the projects that you worked on, you made tools for other developers to use, which is a good thing to do, but it's meaning you had to make something, spend time on it, as opposed to just working with what's already in the box. You had to make like a new add-on to that. This is fine. It's extra work and it doesn't always work for everybody. It's a specialized use case, and you suddenly start working on the thing that you didn't want to work on. I would recommend against it. You should pick a file structure that works.
I would say just one of the last tricks on that. Even though that's true, I don't even have to, because what I'm trying to get across here is there's about 50 tools pre-built in Unity that nobody uses that already does this. I do an extra above because I'm used to it. I can do it in like 40 minutes because I have existing scripts. So you're right. I'm not like selling that as a you must do the whole write custom overlays, but I am saying if you use what's already there in what's considered a concept of an asset management solution, all of this stuff's already there. There's tagging, there's grouping, there's filtering by types, there's filtering by asset definition. There's all of this is there. You just have to know how to use it without any extra tooling.
So here's the last part about this, and just to wrap it up. Tooling is good if you can build it. If you can have it out of the box, that's even better. The problem becomes that this only works while you're using the tool. And a lot of people are not only using the tool. This is more prominent when you're actually working with an external tool, trying to bring in an asset into the tool. Because if you're working from Photoshop and you're trying to export 4 textures and you need to know where to export them to, your file structure matters because you need to know where they go. If you want to press save and make sure it goes to 4 different folders, that's way harder than it's going to one folder and coming out as 4 different files, depending on what asset tools you have available on that other end. Now, you could make an argument that if you're opening any single one of them on the Unity side of the project, it should open the proper Photoshop thing to show you all 4 or the original source asset, but then it means the source asset needs to know where to exist. It's a more complex problem than it's just on Unity's side and everything is within Unity and you just use Unity's tools, especially when you have a lot of different power tools that come in that Unity cannot replicate. Like, we think about textures and everything is just something pre-built, but somebody else is making them. Somebody else is bringing them in. If you're making a 3D project and you have a character model and then a separate character animation and separate character clothes and textures, etc., it's a bunch of different stuff. If they all have to go to different places, you have to make an automation on the other end to make sure that it works with the Unity structure project without any of Unity's tools. And it's a really important thing to know. Now, you could make an argument that the folder in Unity should just be an ingest folder and everything that you throw in it should be automatically moved into other folders in the project. And this is a perfect way to go about it. And then you don't actually need a project structure except saying, hey, we have this tool. This tool says the project structure doesn't matter as long as you use the ingest folder. Just start using the ingest folder. Problem with that is now you don't know where things go after you've thrown them into the ingest folder. And this is fine as long as your tooling has fast search. If you're using Windows default Explorer search, you're in for a rough time. If you're on GitHub, that's better because GitHub shows you most relative paths pretty quickly, but you can immediately interact with the file on your own PC by the nature of doing that. If you are in the Unity project, you have the Unity project search, and then you can click double-click the asset there, but you have no guarantee it's the source asset, as I explained, because you work with the output assets. So the entire thing is fundamentally broken if you ignore the fact that you're not working with Unity alone.
Maybe, but I mean, my argument to that would be if your goal is to get a project done and there is some workflow steps that are a hindrance for somebody else. I've talked before about the idea of bottlenecking and finding out where your sort of cost and time is being spent. If a member of your team, I've seen this a lot, where a member of the team, I used to work with a team where they would literally go through all their files and rename them before they gave it to us. But that would be pointless because we would have to rename stuff for what we need anyway. And there was just no communication between the fact that they were doing this extra step they thought was helping us and it was a complete waste of time. And so the answer is normally these kinds of things are boiling down to people just not communicating. And the other side of it is sometimes you have people who are going through this whole tedious step they have to do. And it's like, no, I can automate that for you. And then I'll just do something, or I will basically take it in the process form and do an automation. So to me, that's more of a project manager role of finding a way of facilitating improvements. And in those cases, if I have somebody whose job it is to manage files in a complicated manner, I will install search everything for them, and I will teach them how to use it. And that people may not like the sound of that, but I will now 10x every operation they have to do with anybody to do with files. And I'm willing to take whatever time it takes to do that because of how long it'll facilitate stuff down the line. So that can help in those cases. But either way, like I want to say one last thing that came up a couple of times. The answer to what software I'm using for labeling and tagging, it's called Unity. There's a button in the bottom right corner. Click any file or any asset. There's a thing at the very bottom right corner of every inspector window. I'll do it right now, and it says Asset Labels. And you click Asset Labels, and there's a little blue circle. You click the blue circle, and it lists all of the labels in your project. You can add any new ones you like, and you'll see all ones that exist from existing things. And in any search box anywhere, you can type L: and any label, and anything with that label will appear instantly in your inspector. And you can have multiple labels, you can use and/or, you can have multiple folder structure, whatever you like. So the short answer is, again, I'm not suggesting extra tools or writing your own custom stuff. If you download certain assets like DoTween, they've already done this. All of their stuff is pre-labeled and pre-managed for you. And if you do the same thing with your own stuff, same thing. Like, I'm not expecting people to do what I do, which is like if you download codes from me, you can literally do a certain level of tags which can find all interfaces or find all things that extend mono behavior, because you might want to modify stuff that, like, I do this for me because I like to be able to go, I want to find a thing, I know it's a mono behavior and I know it's to do with UI, so I can do a little thing and I can find every UI script that happens to be based on mono behavior. I don't expect everyone to do this, but what I am saying is that at a very basic level, if you're telling me, should I store all the dragons together or should I store all the fire related stuff together, why not just put a dragon and fire tag on both and make a search filter that does both? And the answer is you have both. There's no cost, there's no whatever. And the answer is, what folder structure should I use? Whatever, I don't care, because that's a different problem. That's not the same thing as a search problem.
I don't think it's true that there's no cost, right? You still have to maintain all the labels and remember to tag everything, right?
Yes, I mean, I will say that's fair, but like I said, it comes down to it's more okay. Fair point. It's not that there's no cost, but what I'm saying is, if you're saying that search is a problem, because you're basically boiling down to, I think a lot of us are kind of saying, if the project doesn't have issues with folder structure, it's not a problem. But if finding things has become a problem, then from a cost perspective, what is more of a cost? Doing some tagging or having this constant question of where did you put that thing and what's the latest version? And even if all of this boils down to one person is in charge of just doing a check. For example, we had a junior on the project who, they're busy some of the time, but some of the time they're not. Them taking on the secondary task of just going through and making sure stuff that people may not have tagged or tagged is a very small task that takes up a small portion of their time and has a massive, downstream effect or benefit. And it's like, I think it's such an easy yes that, like, I agree that there's some cost, sure, but the more you do this, the more you get used to automations and build your own stuff, and it becomes less of a problem. But even if you're just getting started, like I said, if the question is simply, if you're struggling, should I use a folder for A or B? Highlight all the things that are that and just write both words. That cost, quote unquote, is vastly less than whatever amount of mental processing you're about to spend in philosophically figuring out whether you should put it in group A or group B,
So yeah. I have one strong follow-up against this. So you are heavily advocating for using tags, but one problem I have with tags is that they have very low discoverability if you don't know that they already exist, because there isn't a list of like, hey, show me all the tags neatly and let me pick which ones I need to look for. And you don't know what to expect, like which tag is which. Now, this is a problem that can be solved relatively quickly, and you can also make a window to just show you all the labels with a toggle on-off in your search.
Plus, if you start typing, it'll autocomplete whatever's available to you. It'll show you all the tags if you're adding them. But if you're doing a search, sure, you're right. You might have to do a search a few times to find the right keyword.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up because, like, discoverability is one of the main problems, which is why we keep going into folder structures. They're known, they're familiar, they're easy to sift through, a literal term that you use with folders. So tags are not exactly the same way.
I will admit, like, I want to put the last devil's advocate myself. I'll say I don't think Unity's solution is great. I think it's sucked in a number of ways, and it's not how I would implement it. But I will say, as somebody who does this sort of like information theory around all of my stuff, I use Eagle for some assets, I use other management tools for others. I will say I have a far easier time finding anything I want on all of my devices across all of my stuff than most people. So whether or not you agree with this implementation, I'm just saying philosophically, I see a lot of people like struggle over should I do it A or B or C or D? And the answer is I don't have those problems because I don't think that way. And I think that's my point. Not the specific solution, but philosophically thinking in terms of information theory rather than folder structures. That's kind of broadly my point.
Okay, you want to hear a funny thing about that, by the way?
Fire away.
We have only talked about my first point from reacting to your long rant. The second point was when you talked about scripts. And on script, you mentioned that you have the actor base and then you're making everything like work on.
But yeah, and I would say only for that to answer, because somebody pointed it out. The reason I do that is actually because of assembly definitions more so than anything else.
Yeah.
But even then, I don't even use them that often, simply because I use them. I've noticed most people don't even know what they are, and they end up confusing people in projects. So unless I either know or am in control of all people managing the coding team, I don't even use them, because I find people freak out and don't know what's going on. I've had to do more management of assembly definitions because I'm getting calls randomly at night because people don't understand why a thing won't compile when they add a random asset. That to me, it's like, I don't care anymore. It's not worth the benefit to me, the cost. So I'm willing to like drop these issues and stuff when they come up as problems. But I will say, when I'm in charge of managing stuff, things tend to go smoother as long as I can say, you may not be used to this, but if you onboard correctly, you will find your life easier. You just have to take the time to engage with me on this. But if I'm seeing it not working, I'll drop it. That's usually the what I'll approach.
Yeah, so 2 follow-ups here. I was about to point out that in terms of personal preference, I would heavily advocate to name your scripts by what they do, not what they are. What they are is a pretty cursed way to make things work, because you're expecting people to discern what the features are, when in fact, when you're using Unity at least, and you're heavily advocating for component usage, components do things. So you name them by what they do, not by what they are. Like destroy after 3 seconds is way easier than projectile. So I would advocate heavily that you name your scripts only based on what they do. And if there is a category of doers, like cooking actions or whatever, you can have that. It's not what they are. It's like, boil, etc., etc. So you can have a domain subname for that, like a namespace folder for it. Ideally, you try to keep it as close to the way the actual code is called, and making sure that it's the most humane you can have it, so when it appears on the actual Unity side and you're actually using the scriptable objects and mono behaviors and what have you, it's easy to find by using the natural terms that you're looking for, as opposed to whatever makes sense in code. I don't need a repository provider asset that filters by class rank or whatever.
You need it to be a manager, a repository provider manager.
Useless terms.
I will say, like, broadly, when I was saying that how I structure it, I agree with you on that too. Just to be clear, it's like I just, the words I will use will be without getting into the whole thing about glossaries and domain terms. When I say like it names, usually it's like what people know. For example, we agree that the term actor means thing in the scene that does logic, and then we might have placeables, which are a type of, and then you downstream it so people know the language you're talking about. I certainly don't mean group it, like, but yeah, it'll be something that's sensible to the team structure and how that works, and it will imply these are environment stuff that is to do with whatever it is and so on.
Pavel, got something you want to say, because the comments seem to be looking at you.
Yes, he's angry. He's been playing Tetris and fuming right now. So
no, I think I'm more on the side of Yorai. Yeah, for me, the tools that Jason is talking about are very good. Yeah, I have many my own editor tools that search art structures, check out structures, and check if assets are correctly done before we are releasing them to Asset Store. Yeah, but our team work on them. If somebody new came in, yeah, he would have big troubles joining the team, and getting him into everything would take quite a while. I would say 2-3 months before he would be able to use all the tools, everything. Yeah, that's why we also always go to file structure. Yeah, the file structure that we always maintain, the naming convention for scripts, textures, shaders, materials, and everything else has to be structured accordingly to what we are doing. We are checking them, and not only that, because we are going a level deeper. Yeah, we are checking what type of files, if it's PNG, JPEG, TGA, depending on what type of mask, texture, and everything it is. We are checking compressions and everything. So yeah, so because when we are releasing asset, it has to be the best optimization for what it does. Yes, so there's a lot of checking that we have to think about when we think about structure. We are not only thinking about structure of folders, we are also thinking what types of files are for what types of data that we need.
So actually, let me actually, that's a very good point. I want to highlight that because something that Glenn said points this out. What I'm saying is not mutually exclusive. What I'm saying is that the way in which you engage with folders has use cases and facilities that you may need. If you're working with Team X, they may need the folders a certain way to make it easy for artists to do X, Y, or Z. My point is, do not structure your folders around search facilities. Sort your folders around these things. What makes sense for what is needed for moving assets in a way that facilitates your team, or artists, or whatever you're doing. My point is all of the search stuff is filtered and supported by the asset database. I'm not saying don't name your folders anything. What I'm saying is that the reasoning and philosophy of you naming things are not around, will this be easy for me to find this thing later in my project? That is the wrong approach philosophically. I'm saying name your folder structures based on what you need folder structures to be for your team and project, and then treat search as a different problem using information theory to solve it. So I'm not saying, for people thinking I'm saying folders are bad or wrong, I'm not. I'm saying they're a completely different universe of problem than the kind of thing that's the real question of, should I name this because it's dragons or fire? Like, that's what I'm saying, is that is not the same question or problem at all.
And two things to add on that on your side this time. One is, if you're bringing somebody into a project, make sure that they understand that they have to follow the structure of the project. And you can discuss this with the team ahead of time so that everybody has whatever they need. And if they need to learn a certain tool that will speed up the project's workflow, you make sure that they learn. If you have an employee that doesn't have the desire to learn a new tool, that's multiple problems that you should address on top of just making sure that they actually use the tool as everybody else does.
But sometimes if they're new, it's hard to get them to learn a new tool while they're learning a bunch of other stuff. And even if they're trying, like, you can overload them.
Yeah, so this is the second thing. If somebody is struggling at the start, you can at least let somebody else move the file into the project for them. They can offer the assets wherever they want outside, and if they come up with a structure that's convenient to them, maybe you can add a converter that just brings things into the project as you need them, or let somebody else do it and guide them through it. After a few times, you make them go in and do that. And if they really cannot adjust, find a way to make their tool do it for them, because there are ways to do it, and you do have engineers.
And on that, like, as a side note too, the other reason why I'm very like bullish on separating these two ideas is because if you do contracting, you often work with people with competing philosophies. A good example of this is I worked on a project where we had a really talented art manager who was then managing other subcontractors doing art. And they like doing it their way. They literally wrote a doc they sent to all subsequent artists and said, we name our files this way and we put them in these folder structures. And my response to that is, cool. So whenever something lands in the art folder, you do you. That's not my problem. You have your way of doing stuff. But separate from that, when there's those of us who need to mess with shader changes because we have to do something or whatever, I can then make a tagging thing where stuff, knowing their folder structure, I can auto label and tag those. And then I can write filters that mean the other people who are in the tech art team don't need to know that structure or care about that stuff or do whatever. They have a magic button that says, here's all the new shaders sorted by time relative to whatever in the level you're in. Done. So again, these things are not mutually exclusive. Folders can be whatever they want, is kind of what I'm getting at, is they can be, you use folders based on the requirements you have per folders, but you don't use them for search. Search is a different problem, to repeat. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
I got a kind of a follow-up question on that, but first I want to hear Powell's folder structure. I want to get into art and importing stuff real quick, but Powell first, yeah. How do you build yours? What's your current structure or your general that you've seen?
Let me just try to showcase it.
Please do that. Just one last thing too on the whole thing of like who pays the cost. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who's worked on a long-term project knows that the time it takes to add new features starts to take longer and longer exponentially as projects grow and get more complicated in most cases. And so the short answer is, who pays the cost? That you will, if you don't take time to think about your organization early. How much and whatever is up to you and your team and what makes sense to you. But the fact of the matter is, choosing not to organize is not a good answer, simply because you'll end up paying the cost somewhere, and I'd rather pay it when it's small. It's like saying, do you do the dishes as they're dirty, or do you clean the house once every 2 years? You'd probably have a much easier time if you clean as you go. This is a unified theory most people understand of basic cleaning, and the same principle goes for organization.
Just a point on that. If you have a project that has multiple features and it keeps getting new features and you're adding more content on top of the feature and every content piece has to interact with those features, you're getting ever increasing amounts of time to add a new thing into your project. And that can be hell if you don't have a fast way to do most things that you need. Just as a mild note, in Terraria, adding a single new magic spell will require 30 file changes at minimum.
The bigger the project, the more the structure has to be well thought out. Yeah, because there can be so much time wasted on adding small things to the project that it's strange. Yeah, so I specially chose this one because it's a folder for the working on project. As you can see, there's some update files that are not assigned to our normal structure folder. Yeah, so my basic structure folder is this element. Yeah, everything that's else from it are things that I'm testing, checking, or using temporarily. For example, these are 3 new files that I haven't assigned. Should we add it now? Should we add it later? And so on. So they are in front of me, so I can look at them and remember that I have to choose: are we deleting them or not? Yeah.
Right there, you always have to see them.
Yeah, always have to see them and then consider if this goes into asset or if this goes into my folder editor. It's separately because these are the tools that I'm using that won't be published with the asset store. Yeah, because this is asset store folder, not this one. So as for example, I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 tools that I wrote for myself, our team, that won't be released with this project, but we use them to check everything and work on it. Yeah. So here is the main folder. The main folder, we have to think about 2 things that we are doing. As we are asset store developers, we are developing and selling assets. So part of the files are the files that are only to this asset. The castle and dungeon is this asset. So this is the main folder for this asset. Any other folder has to be the same path in all of our assets that we are releasing on asset store. It has to have all the GUID for each of the assets the same. So if someone imports the castle, then imports lava, it won't import 2 times the same asset. All the assets have to be the same. Yeah. So we are checking all the GUIDs, we are checking everything if it works well on all the assets and so on. So here we have from, I think, the castle, and we also have the spline tool, which is part of lava, RAM, and castle assets, and also uses them forests and so on. So it has separate assets. Yeah, and then each asset has its main structure for them. We mostly structure them for users to be quickly able to find what they are looking for. So if they go into castle, they mostly will be searching for architecture, for the cliffs that we are seeing, for the ground textures that we are seeing. So we structure the folder of what user will need rather than types of objects. Yeah. Then if you go for the architecture, then we split them again, and then if you go down into doors, we are seeing materials, textures, prefabs, and models. Yeah. So we always split them modularly. So each module has what user can use, because many users, when they import asset, they import it into separate folder, and they just want to take buildings. They just want to take ground and so on. So they can just take one folder, copy into their own folder, and it should work without anything other in this project. Yes, so we have to do it a little different than when I would be doing a game, but mostly when I started doing assets, I often do something like that for art design things, that we split them into types of modules that are everything is in a small folder that has everything, textures, models, etc. Not models separately and then models split, textures separately. No, we want them together. If we have something that's used between many assets, then we are putting it into separate folder, like we have particle shaders, or we have object shaders that split between more than one asset or more than one project. Yeah, so we have them separately, so many projects can use them together if you import them and it works correctly.
Perfect.
You had an interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like you're structuring it more about you're managing dependencies essentially. You're saying,
Yeah.
here's the common things that everything's going to use, so you need to put them here. And if you want to only use the buildings, they don't depend on anything, so they should be in their own folders, but you can copy just that piece into their project.
Yeah, and we have to do it because that's how our users use them. Yeah, we checked how our users use them, how people create everything. It has to be quickly that you discover everything quickly, and you can take it out of this asset and use it separately for your own asset. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think that's also how people tend to structure their code, right? If you have, especially if you're using assembly definitions, you have to say, okay, which pieces depend on which other pieces, and organize the folders.
Yeah, we do the same with scripts. Here, the main scripts are in, for example, the splines have the shaders, have the scripts. The scripts have assembly definition, one for the all scripts, and separate one for the editor part of scripts that the user can use if they want. Yeah.
That actually brings up an interesting point if we are going to talk about assembly definitions. One problem that I see a lot of game developers struggle with is when you start using assembly definitions, you're saying, okay, this is a namespace for all combat action, and this is a namespace for menu stuff. Usually, the two don't have to interact until you end up with one script that has to access something specific to one thing in the other assembly. This is one of those cursed problems where people don't know what to do, because now you either make one depend on the other, or you're making like a shared assembly that points to everything else, and now it can use everything, and now you unknowingly start including all of your game content in that folder instead of doing it properly with the separations. So how do you all approach this? Because I have not found a happy medium for people I've worked with yet.
Yeah, my approach is start simple. So you start with everything in one assembly definition, and then you tease it apart as the complexity grows. Because at first, like, you don't really care, because you don't actually know what is your project structure going to be. You know, what's going to depend on what components am I going to have? I don't know. So you start in one place, so everything's easy to reference, and you think about what area you're going, but you don't worry too much about it. But then as things start taking shape, and you start saying, okay, well, we have separate code that needs to be for iOS only or something. So you start segregating that piece into an assembly definition. You start saying that thing needs to then take a dependency on our core components. And so I like to let it evolve organically, but then always think about dependencies. What depends on what? Don't think too much about, okay, I have a feature, so I need a separate assembly definition for that feature. It's more about how you're going to manage your dependencies.
Anybody else?
I will say, as a almost counterpoint to everything I've said up to this point, my answer is I don't. I give up. And the main reason why, like, truthfully, because even if you have a perfectly good and cogent system, the fact of the matter is, if you've got anybody on your team who is an asset they want or need or like for their project, they're going to press the import button at some stage and then panic. And the fact that most assets, at a minimum, have two folders, the runtime and the editor, means at a minimum you have to explain the difference between having editor and runtime assembly definitions. Never, like, even if you try, like I literally have done before in a project, there is our code runtime, our code editor, third-party runtime, third-party editor, and I said, whatever asset you download, at least divide it into these two. All you have to do is move the folder, find the subfolder called editor, and even with just those 4 buckets, everything panics. I'm getting calls at 3 in the morning. It's just like, as far as I'm concerned, unless, just like I said before, unless you're literally the person in charge exclusively of one thing, I wouldn't bother. And when it comes to assets, you cannot control the fact that somebody says at the 0th hour, we decide we want some kind of splines. We chose this spline asset, and you're not there to ensure they onboard the asset correctly. So all of my stuff I talk about for search is different philosophically for me than trying to manage assembly definitions, because I don't even bother. Because if it's third-party stuff, I'll just be like, just throw in the project. Our stuff, I might do 1 or 2 folders and explain to people how we'd structure, a base dependency and have different things for whatever. But broadly speaking, I won't even bother, because it's just, it ends up, you have to pay the cost benefit. And I've found that unless you have a philosophy you can onboard people onto, assembly definitions are too techy for everyone on the team to be on board with.
Is there ever a scenario where the benefit just outweighs that cost, though?
Yes.
But if it does, I will happily take the time. I'll either myself do it or I'll have someone else do it, because usually it's not, again, like anything, it's the 80-20 thing. It's like normally if you're having a huge slowdown, it's because of asset A or asset B. You could then just sit there, do the one thing and say, have we all locked in assets? Any assets anybody wants to add, whatever. And then you can put up a red flag to the team and say, no more adding assets unless you contact this person first. And at least you've now got a gate to do that. But I won't do that out this gate. I will start out with like, just do whatever. And as the project, if you hit that sort of asymptotic point where like, for the most part, people aren't adding new assets because we're like too far into the project to be messing with it, then maybe I'll pause and do it then. But my point is I won't like try to enforce a Boy Scout rule early, because again, it just causes chaos, because everyone, from my experience, everyone just keeps adding assets and removing them and changing stuff. And even if you use the standard assembly definitions, you're going to get people who are writing scripts or using scripts and then going, why can't I reference this? Oh, you have to open up the assembly definition in the runtime thing and add a reference to theirs because they haven't. It's just not worth the amount of headaches unless everybody is technically on board.
And ideally, if Unity ever starts upgrading the project structure to a more modern one, the compilation speed will be quicker, and then we will have to deal with this less.
Yeah, all of my arguments boil down to, quite frankly, the way Unity does it sucks and it's confusing. Like, I'm not against the philosophy of it. In fact, I strongly agree with assembly definitions. I'm the kind of person who makes my own class definitions in C# separately anyway. So obviously, I'm super on board with like drawing your dependency chains. But I just mean you have to play practicalities, because it may sound like I'm talking about some idealistic tag future, but I truly amn't. All of the stuff I'm saying is organically built over time to solve problems, and I will do the least amount of work required to make everything easier for everyone possible. I'm just pointing out these things exist. You don't have to like jump in and build a big system. I will cut corners and do stuff that makes sense, but try to do it in a way that onboards people cleanly as possible.
One more thing here is that I've found multiple ways to save on time and complexity for others that don't have the knowledge of assembly definitions. The first one is, if you have an editor script, usually you can just add if Unity editor. That ensures that the game can build regardless of if you put the thing not in the editor folder or not appropriately handled it. So you didn't make an assembly definition that thing references something that you shouldn't be able to have, etc. So that helps. Another thing is, you should look at it at how many seconds will this save in the long run, because we had a user literally in your server talking about how they have a 50-second delay every time that they change anything in the assembly definition, because the game had this much code that it started to slow things down because it had a lot of dependencies, and the dependencies has to compile, and then the code has to compile alongside it. In that point, you can try and do a separation, but you can do it in a separation such that only a certain piece of the content is sliced off and put into an assembly definition, and the rest is still like wild and out there, which is something that I found pretty interesting, because you basically get like the subdivide automatically by what is actually in and what is actually not in. The third
Actually,
thing
on that divide, just one thing. Another thing drives me insane, which I just wish more asset developers would do. One of my favorite assets is Choreographer. I talk about it a lot. I won't go into detail, it doesn't matter. But I will say one thing they do, which I absolutely adore, is they split their entire asset into two folders. One, which is all the stuff that you need to run it, and one which is all of the readmes, the documentation, the examples, the whatever. And so when I have a new project, and having done it a million times, I install the package and I just delete a whole folder. And I don't have a bunch of vestigial assets of stuff, because what you don't realize is it's not just the folders, it's also going to be all of the like extra stuff, that all the materials, all of the stuff, all the textures and whatever. And I hate so much when you work with people and they download these like, oh, I want to download this asset. And the developer is really nice and provides this really detailed scene that comes with 36 rocks and a bunch of images and trees and whatever. And now that asset dev has committed to our repo a whole pile of crap that we now have to delete and deal with stuff. And it's just being able to say, if you download an asset, delete their examples folder unless you actually want them for the project. I mean, it's much harder because most projects, they don't do that. They might have an examples folder, but they might have 4 in their subdirectory thing structured. And then some of the files are relatively just infuriating. If you have stuff that's required to run and stuff that represents help, leave the two so that people can choose what they want to keep, but delete bulk, especially scenes. If there's anything that requires me to keep your bloody sample scene in my project because I have to start rooting it out of your core assets, it drives me insane.
One more thing. Alon, you said you're going to wait until there is enough to separate before you start doing this. I fully agree with that, except I try to do something way worse, which is to make sure that everybody understands that an assembly definition is going to be required in the future. I will usually make one literally at the start. So everything is under one assembly definition, but
Yes.
any dependency that you put in is going to error out if you don't understand that this exists. And then we can start looking into separating everything. And I'm not doing this because I'm mean. I just want to be very clear here. I'm doing this because I expect things to go slow, and I want to separate out what we need versus what we don't need. And this also reveals when things that you import don't have assembly definitions. So one asset that I love to use, and I've used a lot of times, is kinematic character controller on the asset store that Unity has recently made free. This is a great asset, but it does not come with assembly definitions by default, which means you have to add them by yourself, which means you have to go in and make one for the kinematic character controller, then one for the kinematic controller editor. And then you have to make sure that it references the kinematic character controller because it's working for that. And then you can start using that assembly definition. Now,
I literally installed the asset, moved all of that, deleted a bunch of stuff, organized it, got rid of their sample stuff, changed their namespace annoying thing where they have .example, blah, 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 fixed all of that stuff, and then made up my own Unity package. And now I have I just have kcc.unity package is my package. I use that when I need it now for those reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And that is like the single best revealer I have that usually gets people onboarded for this really quickly. And it also lets me eventually just have assembly definitions without having to do it in the middle and start moving a bunch of stuff and unexpectedly having things break because they were not flagged for an editor properly or whatever. And
it lets you also see from the very beginning what exactly your code depends on.
Yeah.
You have to declare them explicitly.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, do you guys prefer the string, the dependencies to be strings or GUIDs?
Well, ideally, I can drag the reference in where possible, but if not, I guess we have to do the string version. I just hate that solution. The whole idea of using scriptable objects to manage it is insane to me, but it is what it is.
Yeah. One more thing. Somebody kept mentioning throughout the stream in the comments, how do we handle tests? So two things here. Unity already has a built-in testing solution, which lets you have editor tests and runtime tests, and you can have separate assemblies for those, and it even would make separate folders for you for those tests. You can include assets there. You can load assets as you're creating tests, and you can have a setup and tear down for the tests. As for how you organize them, it's by feature testing, and you never, ever need to test features that are not your own. This is something very important that I see gets a lot of dev time wasted on, which is I am going to test if Unity's physics system is actually doing the correct thing. This is not what testing is for. You're supposed to trust that they've already done the work for you. If you have
I've seen people test if spacebar works and stuff. I'm like, congrats, the thing that does the thing does the thing. It's like, okay, if you want to write that code, feel free.
It works every time, huh?
Yeah, so here's the problem with that. The reason that you make tests is to make sure that when your code changes, the feature doesn't break. You cannot make a test for a feature you cannot change and expect to be able to do anything about it. The only possible time where you'll ever want to do that is that if you're going to get that other code to change, which is if you update Unity or a package that you're using. And then adding tests for that is futile because they're already supposed to be doing that for you. So unless you got a really nasty case of one time we updated the Unity project to 2021.3 point whatever, and everything broke because the physics changed, okay.
Exactly. Unless you're Powell, have to deal with Unity breaking things on you all of the time. Most of us don't have to deal with those problems. But I will say I definitely agree with you on that. But I will say one small asterisk that again I think is part of the problem here. Like you said, people will often test stuff they don't need to test, and without getting too down a meta rabbit hole here, I think the reason why that's a problem is people don't really understand that relationship, right? That this same with the assembly definitions. All of these things are downstream from the idea of understanding dependency chain, control flow, and dependency inversion. And if you don't really think that way, you're going to have a really hard time knowing okay, given this thing, how do I break it up such that the right arrows are drawn in a single direction to do whatever? And this is kind of, again, why I personally try not to lean into assembly definitions, because I've noticed that like just people don't think that way. Like even programmers, like you have to kind of learn to get used to the idea that assemblies flow in a direction that are compiled, and the whole DLL linking concept. And so with that, like the idea of getting people to understand their stuff in this sort of hierarchical manner is just like, unless you think that way, it's an extra step. And I find rarely do you get the whole team on board. And so all of these things to me are downstream problems. That the short answer is, if you can get someone in charge of it, good. If you can get someone in charge of it to teach it to the people under them to solve it, and so they work it and say problems, good. But broadly speaking, if it's going to hit everybody, you're not going to get everybody on board. And so you can only do it at a certain level. And unfortunately, with assembly definitions, you can't really just say they only affect the coders because they affect any asset that gets imported. If you could do that, if you could draw a line and say they only affect your stuff and everything added is automatic, sure. But that doesn't work because people will want to write quick test scripts and they won't be able to engage with the other stuff because of those boundary lines and won't know how to tie it together. So that's my like limiting factor, is the fact that you cannot just say only the people who understand this stuff have to use it. It will affect everybody.
Yeah.
Do you guys wish that assembly definitions worked for assets, or do you think that would be worse?
That would be worse, I think. Definitely worse.
Yeah. I don't see a place where this makes sense unless the scene starts depending on these assemblies. And
well, you already have assets depending on each other, right? So the question is, could you group them?
Well, I mean, technically, this is how addressables work. Like, without going to the whole big thing, this is technically how addressables literally function. But again, it's the problem of like, you have to explain to people, how do you bucket your stuff such that the hierarchy chain avoids the least amount? And again, people don't think that way. So that's why you need someone to manage that philosophically. You can't just have people throw stuff in, you know?
There is actually something big to mention here. In Unreal, this is actually really transparent to the user, because on any asset that you have in the project, you can literally right-click and click See Dependency Tree. And it will literally show you all the assets and scripts that are associated to that asset. And you can see how much memory they consume. So you know, hey, I'm importing this one pot of plants here, and the sunflower texture is like 4K, and also the blueprint is actually plant, and plant actually imports all the other flowers, so I'm importing 2 gigabytes just by making like one sunflower pot in the garden. Now, in regards to how you actually manage assets for tests in the Unity project, I would say ideally try to make sure that they are completely isolated, such that if you are preparing an asset in advance and not just constructing it in code with some setup method, which would be a better solution for the most part because you don't need it in visuals, etc. If you are making assets in your project so you can load them in to make a test with, make sure that they will not change unless the test actually demands that they change. A lot of common mistakes would be having a shared minions asset, and if you have any change in your game, you change the minion, and now all the assets are updated to use that minion. This doesn't necessarily work, because if you're adding a new feature to a minion that changes how a certain test that tests a specific system that has not changed changes, that test can now fail by the nature of adding something that shouldn't have been there. So when you share things between tests, you pollute what the thing does for the purpose of testing. So make sure those are isolated.
Yeah, and also to Bad Scott's point, this isn't about the source code in the golden master copy. A good example of this is if you're using assembly definitions and someone on the team doesn't understand it, and you've got a co-located team where half of you's in Australia and half of you's in Ireland or America or wherever. If someone tries to add a package to play with something, to try out some new asset, and the entire
on their own local system, right?
On their own local system,
like an artist, designer.
And the only person who can help them is not there, and they have to wait for 7 hours till somebody comes by to help them and teach them how to do it. They've wasted an entire day of possible development time. So this is not just is your code good? This is like literally, again, this is why I get random calls at 3 a.m. going, help, person X is trying to like just work on their local system and they can't. And it's like, take the folder, drag it into the one called third party, drag it into the one called runtime, go into that folder, take the one called editor, drag it out and put it into the editor folder. Okay, now you can work on the project. And even though we have a Notion board with all of this stuff, with all of the steps and whatever, again, it's not feasible. You have to be pragmatic on what will or will not actually happen.
All right, Jason, I'll stop calling you at 3 a.m. I get it now. You don't like it. Jesus.
It's the
Uh,
time zones. It makes it difficult to know exactly when it's 3 in the morning. Oh.
For the person asking about get ignore for third-party assets, you absolutely don't get ignore third-party assets. You need a specific version to be identical for everybody. If people start importing different versions because the asset randomly updated, you can break the entire project. Further, some third-party assets make you change them. They literally will have you go in and like edit whatever scriptable object has their configuration that is actually how it's stored behind an editor window that they give you. Don't git ignore third-party assets.
You don't need to git ignore them, but you can extract them to a separate repository and pull them in through like a package so that they're not polluting your
Your
core.
project by
Yeah.
that is still risky because you still have to now manage two repositories every time you're making a change, and then if you name the changes differently or you commit them differently, it's harder to work with, especially since they're all under like the same asset structure where you have a Git repository under assets for like third-party stuff, and then you have a Git repository for your own stuff.
Yeah, just run a symlink. Fine, just have it all
But
automatically.
actually, in a way, it's good because I tend to see if you include a third-party asset in your main project, people will start modifying it, and then you can't take updates.
Sometimes it depends a lot on
even
the
moving
team.
folder. That still drives me. Why, dear Unity, is it that when I move a bloody thing from an existing folder the asset creator put, it's like, oh, let's just completely break everything because it doesn't understand that I wanted to slightly modify the directory structure. It's like, that drives me insane.
So talking about setting up assets, yesterday.
Oh, actually, one last thing on this, because it was like every so often Unity surprises you with something they do that's good. And just wanted to highlight one thing. In version 6, you can actually have a mono behavior where the name of the mono behavior is different than the name of the CS file, and it doesn't break. There we go.
Really?
Yeah.
Woo!
I never noticed that. I have to play around with that a little bit.
Don't.
There's one amazing small thing that you can actually do. It drives me insane. Yeah. Anyway,
I don't intend to, but to use it regularly. But it is a little frustrating. Can you do multiple mono behaviors in the file now?
I played with it much. I just noticed that one time I did it. I went, wait a minute, I didn't fix it yet, and I looked over and it hadn't broken. I'm like, oh, that's a nice feature. But,
I would still say this is risky grounds. Remember, 6 is in preview. Please go ahead with caution.
Oh yeah, like it's not a feature you should use. What I'm saying is when you're working with non-dev, and then they change the name of the thing, and they don't use all of the automations to auto change the file name, and it breaks, you no longer have to be on standby at 3 in the morning. Fix these things again. So.
Okay, we got it. You're up in 3 in the morning.
yes, I am. Way too often, but anyway.
But anyway, so when you guys mentioned setting up configs for an asset real quick, I was reminded of yesterday when I was setting up Proxima for remote debugging on an Android device, going in and setting the correct config. And I just wanted to, especially since Lon's here, just remind everybody that it exists, because I don't know if everybody knows it exists. There's a free version, there's a paid version that does a lot more. But if you haven't tried it out yet, and especially if you're building to a mobile device or any other device that's not just Windows, it's super, super helpful. It'll let you run on the device and then have a full-on inspector, basically, where you can see all of the hierarchy, see the logs, run commands, and do a lot of other fun stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to mention it. It's super helpful for me, and I realized that not everybody knows it exists. So anybody have anything else to mention about it?
One thing that is important to explain why this asset is extremely useful is that if you're building a project and you're putting it on a different device, you're going to usually expect, by the nature of you having written your logic one way, that it's going to run one way. The thing you don't understand is that different devices come with different system defaults that change things that you don't expect to change. So for example, if you're using Flutter and you're making an application and you're putting a few buttons bunched together so there is no space between them, and then you're seeing it on Windows and it looks as you designed it, you're going to assume it's going to look perfect on the mobile. But as soon as you build for mobile and deploy it on an Android phone, they suddenly have 16 pixels difference. Why is that? Because Flutter has a default theme by platform, and the theme changes the padding for buttons as you go for those different platforms. So they're easier to use on a mobile device where you can fat finger as opposed to keyboard and mouse on the PC. So you have to manually adjust for that. And if you didn't expect it and you didn't even know this existed, it's going to be very problematic to find out if you don't have access to debugging tools. So
Well, you
Yeah,
have to
and
go
even
back and
like-
forth to figure out the correct values for stuff, right? You got to keep doing builds and checking stuff in here. You can just get in, change data, run code, and speed stuff up. I think of it mostly as like a giant time saver, and also a good debugger for when things work fine in the editor and they work fine on iOS, but they don't work on Android. Now, what the hell's different? And you can go in and add logs and go through the normal debugging step, or you can just use this and get right in there. It's as if you're running in the editor almost, or very close to it. And like I said, there's free versions, so you can just go try it out and see how useful and powerful it is. I just realized that Story's head is missing in this view. Let's get it back in here.
Thanks for the
yeah, I was gonna say,
clarification.
it's also really good for if you forget to support certain platforms. A good example of this is if you want to do clipboard support for copy and paste, you use the system buffer in like the default version, but that works for like all things like Android as well, but you lose a lot of features. If you want to do some really clever stuff with it, where you basically paste differently depending on the supported platform, or use like your own buffer, you can do some really cool stuff with D-word IDs for like, you can actually have multiple things where you paste multiple things to the clipboard and only paste out certain things depending on the context. You can do that on Windows, but you have to use a particular DLL. And obviously, if you did all of this great features and then run it on Android and notice your clipboard doesn't work, you forgot to support the version that does the normal boring system buffer. So these kinds of things are great. As like, oh yeah, I'm focusing too specifically on this one platform and this one use case. So.
Yeah, thanks, guys. If anybody has issues or wants support with this, feel free to hit up the Discord as well. One cool use case I was using it for recently was I was trying to determine which components were contributing to bad performance on one of the devices. And it's really easy to go into here and just like turn things off and see how does the performance get affected, even if you're using the Unity profiler, separately.
Oh, also just another thing, because the amount of times I do something stupid, one that caught me off guard, it's the amount of times I've worked on projects where I build custom editors, and for ease of use, I put a lot of logic in the onValidate, because the amount of times you want to like react real time to people modifying things. I've literally made stuff where it's beautiful and works in the editor, but when you actually build it to the device, the bloody code that's like doing the validation only happens in onValidate, because I didn't actually put it in any of the real running code, and I'm not going to catch that unless I have something that lets me check it on the device. And then it's like, oh, of course, I'm literally not running the initializer because I only ran it on Validate, which is never an issue in the editor, but always an issue on build. And yeah, so having a tool to actually inspect stuff is very nice.
There is actually something interesting to say here, but I tend to be very wary of adding new monobehavior lifecycle methods. And I try to restrict them by the platform that I'm going to be working with. So I usually just automatically do if Unity editor when I work with onValidate and reset, which is something that I don't see other people doing. And it's something that I think I picked up when I didn't even have Rider. So I was like, how do I deal with this? So it's pretty interesting. Do other people do that, or?
I should. I don't, but I probably should.
One of the most subtle bugs in Unity, features, behaviors in Unity is that the lifecycle methods get called in random order across monobehaviors. This has bit me so many times. And so I'll deploy to a Mac device and it'll work differently than Windows just because start got called differently in different order between two components.
Yeah, and that's why, like, specifically for things like what I call my bootstrapping portion, I will always do the same thing, which I have my runtime initialize unload, which does the manager prefab, and then I have a hierarchy of sub-objects, and those are called in a array in Awake, and then I iterate those myself. And that way I can like sort if I want by name or something, and I can ensure the order. I try not to rely on having an order, but at least I know one, that the manager will run first, two, it'll manage its own functions, and then once the scene starts, I can reliably say that all the manager stuff is done first. I don't do it like at a micro level per scene, but I do want to make sure that at least that like run state of the world is ready before anything goes after that point.
All I'm hearing here is that we're going to have to talk about that player loop system.
Yeah, well, that was one of the other
Oh, yeah.
architectural things I wanted to talk about too, was how we
Okay,
do
well,
that.
But before that, I just want to point out that if you ever see yourself using Unity Editor, make sure that you're using if Unity Editor if it's within a monobehavioral class. It will usually catch you off guard on gizmos, like drawing gizmos, etc. And the validation reset. There was one other lifecycle.
Handles is another one that does that a lot. So with namespace, I always make sure, because handles, whenever I try to do a handle, I'll always do the whole import. And again, if you're using like an automation thing like Rider, even if you put the name, double check at the top, it doesn't have using Unity Editor, because you might have imported the namespace.
Yeah.
So I will always
Yeah.
prefix it on my functions, because I don't like ever having it up there. So I may not do what you're saying with the ifdef, but I will make sure, I will always scroll to the top and go, there is no reference line to the.
You're still gonna do the
Yeah.
if def on that line though,
On that
right?
chunk,
In the
yeah,
on
we'll-
validate
yeah.
or around it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
You guys want to go into that other architecture stuff? Before we do, I did share a link real quick to the Publisher of the Week sale. I forgot to do it last week, and I felt bad because it's good stuff. There's a cool farm animal pack and some really cool other packs in there from the same publisher, including some visual effects. So you can go check them out after you go grab Proxima and try it out, because it's worth grabbing. And of course, game modules for getting any updates, Andrew?
Yes, at some point. I'm doing my character creation scene at the moment for my own game, and in this process, I am tweaking a few small things, nothing major, adding a couple more methods that are just, oh, why didn't I add that before? Type of things.
Okay, fair enough. Well, go check all those out. They're all linked in. Yeah, let's talk about this loop stuff. And like not just the game loop, but game initialization too. Like how you go through, do the initialization, and then the loop.
yeah.
Who wants to-
Um,
all right.
Yeah, so
Right.
just to give a rundown on what we are actually talking about when we're talking about the player loop system. Traditionally, if you're a game developer, you have methods that you need to call in a certain sequence to have a game running. If you are using Unity, you have Unity monobehaviors giving you most access to that with their start, awake, update, late update methods. And for rendering, you tend to use renderer components. You tend to not do any of that by yourself. If you're handling a bit more advanced content, you usually have access points for drawing random command buffers and making custom post-processing through render passes, etc., etc. But you can go a level beyond that. Not everything needs to be in a monobehavior. And this is where we're getting into random initialization stuff and editor hooks and player loop system
I think
hooks.
before we get too into that, I just want to say one thing is that
Yeah.
even before that, I think it's worth going like the mild thing before, which is like broadly any application you run, you press play, there has to be a like enter here, like the first scene of a movie. There's a start something, and it has to run things up. And normally in like other applications, you choose first line runs here, and then you build your application and system downstream. The kind of benefit / magic of Unity is it just says, just write stuff. Sometimes it starts, sometimes it just do your own thing, and we'll like figure it out. And by figure it out, it means it will aggregate all of the things you've ever made, which may have an awake, a start, whatever these things are, and it will bundle them somewhere and then choose how to run them. And then this is the whole, like, it has one, its own life cycle per script, and then two, its own life cycle per like scene and structure. And it basically builds this hierarchy. And we'll go into the details in a second. But my point is just that it's doing all this magic for you, but you still have to think about it in terms of there is a starts doing something. There's a bunch of things, and then the things go through somewhere. There is something that begins somewhere, and Unity's just handling that magic for you.
Yeah. Just to clarify, none of this is magic. You're telling Unity, hey, I have stuff. Unity agrees, okay, you have stuff. I am taking the stuff. I am going to call whatever I can find within the stuff. This is literally what you have.
How is that not magic?
That's not magic because it's literally external assembly reference.
Well, it's
Reflection.
magic in that if I write a piece of code and I have not said when it runs, it will just happen to run somewhere at some point. That's what I mean by magic. I mean, you didn't decide, you didn't call go, you didn't like say play this thing, you didn't start it. Something did
Yeah,
a thing.
but you're doing that all the time when you're writing a script. If you're writing a weapon and you're saying attack, you don't necessarily call on the weapon when it attacks. You're letting another system handle it. If a character
but
attacks when it's using a weapon, or whether a bot sentry takes the weapon and starts using it, or whatever. The idea is
Yeah,
you're
but
making something that
you're
has
being-
an update method and you're letting the
Yeah.
engine handle it.
Yeah, but you're doing it from like I'm only saying this because you're coming at it from presumptive angle of somebody who's Unity familiar, going in a world where you were using a component model, all the things you said. But that's my point is if you didn't come from that angle, someone like me when I first started using Unity, it was magic because I'm like, where's the start function? I want to begin by learning where the first line of code in Unity runs and walk my way through the understanding of when this script will run. And the answer is, we'll do it. Don't worry. That is kind of magic in that I did not get to say, run this, then run this, then run this. I now understand that, obviously, but my point is, if you're not familiar with a component model, to you, how an application can have 50 different start points is kind of insane. And you have to understand what's happening to get you there.
Yeah, but it's not different start points for the application, it's start points for different objects. Okay, just to go back to the original topic though. Unity has lifecycle methods. It asks you to use them. You use them for mono behaviors. Those are individual objects that you add to a scene. Unity loads the scene. This is part of Unity's code. The scene has objects. Unity loads those objects. Once all those objects are loaded, it calls awake. It calls start, and whenever it updates, it says call update. Whenever it late updates, call late update, and whenever it needs to render, it tells the renderers, hey, renderers, render. With that said, sometimes you don't have access to put something in the middle when you need to, or something way to start before anything awakes or starts. For example, if you want to have a script that starts up an external service and you don't want it to be tied down to any scene, so you don't have to load that specific scene, so it has that specific object, so that specific object calls start and calls the external service, there are ways to do that. And one of the ways to do it without any mono behavior, not tied to any scene, is with the initialize on load method. Unity gives you a keyword, an attribute you can put on a method that Unity will say, hey, when I start the Unity application, I will find that method and I will call it. You can do whatever you want within that method. It will be called whenever you say it does, because you can specify a time. There are, I think, 6 different values you can set on application start, before scene load, on scene load, after something like that. And if it finds those methods, it calls them. These are not tied to mono behaviors, which means they will not be called when an object starts its process, because you use start and awake for that. And it lets you do whatever external things you need, including loading resources to use on those awake and start methods. You can literally do a thing where it says, hey, when the application starts, create all these stats, and now on start, set attack to free. On a spell.
Yeah, that's why though. So that's the reason I was kind of hammering home on this idea of magic, because I can say with absolute certainty, if I knew this function existed, I would have fast forwarded my Unity learning by about a year, unironically, because I spent a lot of time fighting this whole idea of how do I figure out, avoiding race conditions in Unity when I don't even understand when I'm loading or what I'm doing. If someone had just told me this is how you make a start function, an entry point, this is where you can use your bootstrapping. If I knew there was just a way for me to run a line of code before even the first scene started, I would have downstream saved myself a year of like philosophical meandering over how to figure out state structures in a component model system. This to me was like a godsend when I first learned it.
Okay, so one important thing to mention here before we move on forward, because these methods are related to the start loop of your assembly, of your code in general, they are not part of any mono behavior. They will not be called with any object. They are only called once. This is important because they're effectively singular methods, not ever called again unless the event that makes them be called happens again. Like if you bind it to a scene start, it will only happen once on a scene start. It will
So it
not
says
happen.
first scene loading here in the example. Sure.
I don't remember. There is one on like scene load, no?
Yeah, this is the scene. This is like the before scene load, and I think they try to call it out there just to make sure that people realize it. Like you're saying, it's only on the one. It's not every scene load. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just noticing that in their naming.
Yeah, like I know it sounds silly, but I mentally treat that as like beginning the scene process. The thing that begins scene management, this happens before that happens. It's the first like initializer, effectively.
Yeah. Now, on top of that, if that system isn't enough for you, because these are one-time call limited events, you can plug into certain Unity hooks that exist, and then you can let those hooks call things for you. This is how most built-in render pipeline commands worked for rendering. You could plug into on render camera or something like that. I forgot the original name. And you could call methods that are tied to, hey, I want to actually add another thing to enter to the camera that's not related to anything in the scene. Do that there. Now, another important thing to mention here, because those things are called from scripts, and those scripts are not mono behaviors, and they are not scriptable objects either, they don't have access to assets by default. This is a very important thing to mention, because if you don't have access to assets and you want to load the assets, you need to make sure that they get loaded. This is in part why the resources folder exists. Another thing is that if you don't want to use the resources folder, you could try to have like scriptable objects load. This is way harder to do. Particularly because you need to make asset bundles, or you have to start using the addressable system. Perfectly valid use case, but now you have a certain thing that gets an attempt to load that's not found in any of your assets. Why is it loading, you ask? Because a random script somewhere in your project is doing it. So you have to make sure that you know this exists, and you need to put it in an easily discoverable place, or make an easily discoverable message that says, hey, we're actually loading this too. This is like one of the caveats of not using this properly. Now, suppose you want to do something in between update and late update. Unity does not give you a hook for that. You could make a script and you could give it an update method and set its priority in the execution script execution order so low that it always gets called last. That is not the proper way to do it. You have a far better way you can do these kind of things, which is specifically plugging into a more advanced system called the player loop system. Unity has a very clearly defined loop that it runs as a program. It's nothing special. It's just a program. It's running things. It loads the application, plays the splash screen, loads whatever assets that it needs to play the game, finds whatever is the first scene to load, because it loaded the configuration for what your project is. Then it loads that scene. It waits until that scene is loaded. It displays the scene. That kind of stuff. And then you get into update cycles. So there is an application tick. Tick says, okay, call update. If there are fixed updates to run the fixed updates. Then run late updates. Then run rendering for each camera that is existent in the game. And then, when you're done, start the loop all over again. Update, fixed updates if possible, late update, etc. You can plug yourself anywhere within that cycle. You can go in and put a new system to be called anywhere. And this is the player loop system. The important thing to mention here is there is only one thing running a system every time. So you can essentially write your own. Why would you use this? Very, very limited use cases. But the original topic we've talked about just calls for it. So you should know that this exists. It's a tool at your disposal now. I will say the code for it is very advanced in comparison to everything else. And this is because you only need to use this in two specific cases. One, you're trying to get maximum performance. If you're trying to get maximum performance, this is where the system becomes useful for you, because it says, hey, run my method between those two parts of the player loop and I will call whatever I need. So you can set up your data for maximum efficiency. So it's not separate mono behaviors that each have their own object that calls its own components, that those components are in entirely different separate places in memory. You don't need any of that. You can literally have an array that is sitting somewhere, completely optimized for whatever structs that you have that you're manipulating massive amounts of information. That one system says, update this one struct array, you're done. Very good. Very nice. The second thing is, if you really don't have a system set up between 2 points and you need it to be set up between those 2 points, you can use that there. This is actually how some of Unity's own packages extend themselves into the Unity editor. If you import the input system package, I'm pretty sure it enters into the player loop system and just adds itself there. So, for example, gamepad inputs gets processed before an update thing.
So, question: if you're using now the player loop, do you ever need to use mono behaviors?
You don't necessarily ever need to use mono behaviors. There is one tiny problem if you don't, which is, again, you don't have direct access to assets. So you have to start managing that by yourself. You could entirely write your game in a single system that you're plugging into update. By the way, you can also disable the update system, so you can literally replace it with your own. And then you can make your own entities, and the entities will have their own update, and you can set up the renderers and let the renderer system do it. Or if you're a crazy lunatic, you can even take out the renderer system and start calling command buffers on your own.
Yeah, but mainly it's ease of use, right? Like, for example, you can have an array of matrices and do all of the stuff yourself, or you can use a transform where you can see it and drag it and move it. Like, it's the same thing. Like, conceptually, it's just managing whether you manage 3 values yourself in a visible form or you're doing it by, number wrangling. So for me, my line, everyone has their own. Mine is, if it's logic, if it doesn't have to be, if it's not an entity that exists in the world, I will managerize it in a separate sort of, it doesn't need life cycles and stuff the same way. But I like to have one entry. So I will, to go back to that point, I'll have my own starting function and have everything ran through my own life cycles. And then when the first scene starts, I can rely on, like, the world is configured to the way I want it to be before it starts. And at that point, I live in Unity land. I don't try to fight the system. I spent far too long in my life trying to fight Unity to make it, like, not a component model. And I realized the answer is, all I really wanted was, I wanted the world to be set up a certain way before Unity kicks in. And so that made me happy. That gave me the best of both worlds. I set up my world where I can, like, do my loads, set stuff in memory, set managers up, make sure the run code runs, do my bootstrapping, choose which services I want to run, do any validation, or in the case of, like, VR, entitlement checks or whatever needs to be done against their service libraries. And then when I press go, the app has started, and I can now live in Unity land with the presumption that I have my service locator or whatever to access things that I know are preloaded, and I don't have to play the stance of, like, ordering which process gets ran in which order. So
yeah,
and you still care about ordering. You want it to be in control.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, I can now care about it on, like, a per scene basis, and not care about it as, like, when does my UI manager load relative to the fact that I've got scenes like it. As long as it's not that level of frustration where you're like, did I load the, like, modals for settings menu? Like, once you get to that level, it's infuriating that it's, like, eating your time into other stuff,
For Dustin Taub, yes, we are talking about, in part, Gitman's video. Another thing there is that he used it for timer systems. So this is one of the things that actually benefits from not having mono behaviors, because you can just add a timer with its own calls to events, and it's not sitting on any simple mono behavior. So if the thing that called it disappears from the scene, the timer doesn't get cancelled. It can literally still call its own code because it's not sitting in the mono behavior space. If you have a coroutine, the standard thing that you call for mono behaviors, if you destroy the object that calls the coroutine simply dies off. So this is where the advantages of this come in.
Although in my case, my answer is I would make a class called timers. It would be under an object called game managers. It would be a prefab. I would do the little chunk of code I pasted to Jason earlier that would just instantiate it at the start. And then my scene has an object in the scene with timers, which I can see, write custom editors for, mess with, have all of the same benefits and all of the stuff I want to add. And I don't have to write a bunch of, like, hooks and things, which doesn't benefit me personally.
So there is a nuanced take there. I just want to point it out. I am personally with Story in that you should probably expose that in the scene, but only because you want to have entire knowledge of what is actually running on your project. And if you are starting to remove things from the scene view, that means you can no longer run that code in isolation. If it's always getting added into the player loop system, and you're now entering a brand new scene, and that code has an error, and you're in a brand new scene, your new scene will error. You don't have a safe space to test new features or add a new content or whatever, because that thing can manipulate what is running currently at any given point in time. So
I think Story was right. Just don't fight against the engine.
I mean, you should probably have some way to disable, like if you're gonna have a test.
yeah, but you're asking somebody to know that it's there at all times as opposed to showing them that it's there at all times. That's the main difference. And you could argue that you can make your own editorial window that shows here are my extra systems, or even expose the player loop and expect people to know which parts are custom and which parts are not. That's entirely possible, by the way. You can literally crawl through the entire player loop system and see every single system in which order it runs, and even make your own new set of system with subsystems and call it only whenever you need to, for whatever reason. This is also in part where ECS comes in. I'm pretty sure they were added around the same version, so ECS can plug into the player loop system to call whatever world simulations it needs. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember it fully.
Can you actually prevent Unity from calling things?
Yeah. You can literally take out the entire default player loop and set your own. The game, the entire thing would break, but you could absolutely do that.
Just go disable rendering on everybody's project for fun.
Well, I mean,
a little script.
like one thing, just it sounds random, but it's a small thing. When I start a brand new Unity project, I remove all the packages, which literally removes the concept of colliders in physics. I start with none of that unless I need it. So I even just do that level. I'll always have like no colliders, no physics, and I'll just work. I mean, you'll add them eventually, but it helps me keep a process of like I add stuff as I need them.
So one thing I would say here is that the one advantage that actually removing updates has is that you can literally stop everything from running without disabling it. Some mono behaviors would have a script that says, actually, if we stop updating, stop running this code, disable this model, etc., like on disable, remove the renderer, etc. You can literally disable the update loop, and now the application is completely frozen. Now, trying to move within that application becomes way more nuisance because you don't have an update method anymore, but you can make your own hook, and then you can make your own script to run around the scene, and then you can check whatever you need completely paused. I don't recommend it. You have the pause button for that. Just saying it exists.
Speaking of that, things that exist that you shouldn't use, I want to address that last comment. So we haven't really touched too much on the fact that there is an execution order concept where you can literally go in and decide what gets called in what order. Feel free if you want to use it, but I strongly recommend if your code has to be magically run in an invisible set order to function, you are asking for trouble in a million different ways when anybody messes with anything or new stuff gets modified or changed. Do not write code with a presumptive order execution ever. That's just not, you will have far too many headaches. You are better off, at minimum, understand that Unity does the whole all awakes before starts, except for ... certain edge cases. You can reliably say that is at least going to be like, do your initializes or set stuff up in awake, and then starts will have the awakes pre-done. But in general, if you require that system A has gone through its whole setup before system B, you will end up chasing this infinite web of problems throughout your project. Try to make sure things can stand on their own. And if you need those callbacks, personally, I have events that fire and Boolean flags on things that say is ready. And I can then verify and check stuff when I need to. I do not expect A will work, then fire B, then fire C, because again, a million things can go wrong. And you might be able to hack your way around that problem by manually tweaking the execution order once or twice, but you cannot rely on that as like an ongoing solution.
And
if you're not attacking the problem, right? You're just changing, like the actual problem is A depends on B, right?
No,
and you're not fixing that.
It's literally a layman's solution to player loop system without a player loop system. Also, I have a very cheeky thing to say about the attribute update after that's added by an asset. Unity actually has
there's
an
one already.
attribute. Yeah, and it's not documented. This is one of the few things not documented in Unity that exists in Unity for years now, that Unity themselves are using, called default execution order attribute. It takes an int, but the int says, when you import this script, it's going to add itself to the default execution order.
Yeah, it's just
of
a
that
priority
one.
order integer. Yeah, because I've seen it. I've literally like opened scripts and seen it and thought, oh, that's cool. I'll never use that. Like I've definitely thought about that. before.
I've seen assets that use it, and I hate it because I'm expecting things to run a certain way, and they're like, wait, why is my thing that's supposed to be priority isn't priority?
I've noticed that with physics-based stuff. Like I downloaded an asset once that was like a tank thing, and it had a whole lot of calculations it was doing to emulate tire treads, and it like basically shunted itself to the top of my execution order to make sure its physics system ran before my stuff. And it's like, cool, but I want to do stuff to manage this, and now I have to. It just became a whole headache, and I was like, I hate this so much.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I stop sharing screen, I guess. I did want to get into art stuff, but I think maybe we'll save that for next week since I'm starting to run short on time, and I feel like we can probably have another full hour or two discussion on importing art and art pipelines and mods. I'd really like to talk about maybe next week systems that I've seen that worked really well where you could add art, modify art, and it just instantly showed up in game versus other ones where I've had like, multi-week turnarounds on pipelines for other games that I've worked on in the past. There's a big difference, and talk about some of the strategies and ways to do that. But I think, like I said, we'll save that for next week, just so we have enough time to really get into it.
I will say, even like not just for art, that's a good topic to get into in general, because I do the same thing with like gizmos and stuff. Like there's a night and day difference between having to press play to move something and verify it's right versus giving someone a way to like see the proxy gizmos and go, actually it is in the right place and the right stuff set up, and they don't have to run it to verify it. So that sort of like runtime feedback or real-time feedback in editor is really good if you can do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go rogue here and say that there are things that you should probably always do that are not available within Unity itself, because you're going to have to change the default importers for Unity by changing the editor. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be a fun, interesting discussion, but I kind of got to running short on time, so I think we'll wrap it up for this week. Anybody have any final thoughts or things you want to share before we go?
I just want to give one caveat to say that I said last video I was on that I'm working on a video. I did, and as few people here can attest, I did make that video. I showed it to some people and got some feedback, and let's just say it's been a while since I've made videos, and so that one came out a bit undercooked. It's back in the oven. I'm still working on a few other things. I've got some scripts going, so I haven't forgotten everybody. It just, I realize I have to correct a few things first, so it's still coming. It's still working on stuff.
Woo.
Nice. Anyone else?
There may or may not be in next month a new asset released on Asset Store.
There probably will be lots of new assets released on the Asset Store.
Yeah,
But a very
but there
special
may be one new interesting one.
Maybe,
With lots of water.
maybe some nature manufacturer ones. Anything you're ready to talk about now, or do you want to talk about it next week?
Let me check if I can showcase something behind me.
Oh, I see arrows.
Yeah, this is one of the tools. Just quick showcase to make everyone interested in coming next week.
Ooh, waterfalls.
Yeah,
Ooh,
this is
surfing pack.
physics-based waterfall that checks how the water should flow around the objects.
Ooh.
Nice.
And this is
So-
only one of the new tools that we will be releasing.
Well, I see waterfall 0.3. Yeah, that looks really cool. Yeah, we'll have to talk more about that as soon as you've got it ready to show and release. So saying maybe next week we'll talk about it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Andrew, you're going to have lots of Magic Pig stuff too next week? Are you going to do waterfalls?
We have a waterfall physics-based package coming out in 5 days.
Called Natural Manufactured Waterfalls.
Yeah, no, Nature Women Facture,
Oh, okay.
female-owned company
Fair enough.
that I own.
All right. Anything new from Virtual Maker?
We're working on something behind the scenes, and I'll just say it's related to continuous integration. So if anybody's interested in that space, hit me up.
I love that space. That's a good space.
I'm actually very interested and have something in mind already for it. So we'll have to talk afterwards.
Yep.
Yeah, I gotta figure out what that is. Now I'm really curious. what it could
Of course, we now have an entire topic. We'll have to explain what continuous integration is.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's the
I'm
link.
not quite ready to talk about it, but working on it.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that soon. Yora, you got anything before we go?
No. Keep coding.
All right, everyone, you heard it there. So yeah, we'll be back next week. Should be same time next week, and then continuing throughout summer and on Saturday mornings, my time, and whatever time it is for everybody else, their time right now. Anyway, don't forget to thumbs up, leave a comment if you got questions, thoughts, or just wanted to say hello, and subscribe so you can come back and get alerted next week when the next episode's on. And we'll see you then. All right. I'm going to find the little goodbye video link and we'll hit it.